Hey there, tonight we're uncovering the gritty realities of life in a medieval manor. Forget the fairy tale feasts. The truth is, you'd be knee-deep in chores and chamber parts by sunrise. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your day in a medieval manor kicks off with a delightful cold rush, as the dawn light spills through the ill-fitting shutters of your drafty chamber. Welcome to your new reality, where central heating is just a fantastical dream, and your bed is more straw than cushion. It's the kind of morning that makes you reconsider all those romantic notions of castle life. Spoiler alert, medieval manners are less Game of Thrones, and more, how did anyone survive this? Let's dive into the architectural quirks first. Those stone walls you see, they do a great job of keeping invaders out, but are equally efficient at trapping the cold in. Medieval manors were built with thick walls, often 2 to 3 feet, designed more for defense against marauding neighbors than for creature comforts. And forget about insulation. The best they could muster were tapestries hung on walls, which did little more than add a splash of color to the otherwise dreary grey. Now, roll out of bed, if you can call it that, and get ready for the morning hustle. Today, you're living in a world where your social standing is as rigid as those stone walls. The lord of the manor, let's call him Lord Grumpapants, enjoys his morning with a feast fit for, well, a lord. Breakfast for him could include bread, cheese, ale, and perhaps some meat if he's feeling particularly extravagant. Meanwhile, down in the smoky kitchens, the scullery maid scrambles to keep up with demands. Her breakfast, a humble bowl of porridge, a thin gruel that tastes about as exciting as it sounds. It's a stark reminder of the hierarchical breakfast club you're now a part of. The manor's morning routine is a finely tuned social machine, and you, my friend, are just another cog. The lord and his family eat first, naturally. Their table is laden with trenchers of bread that serve as both plates and a testament to the era's waste-not philosophy. Remember, we're talking about a time when bread was more than just a side dish. It was a staple, often making up the bulk of a meal. The leftover trenchers, soaked with juices from meats and stews, are later distributed to the lower orders, a practice that keeps the manor's economy of leftovers running. Downstairs, the servants have their own pecking order. The steward, essentially the lord's right-hand man, might score a leftover meat pie, while the lowly scullery maid is left with whatever's left. It's a world where your place at the table, or lack thereof, says everything about your place in life. But why does any of this matter? Well, in medieval society, food was more than sustenance. It was a symbol of power, wealth, and control. The ability to provide lavish meals was a public demonstration of the lord's dominance and the manor's prosperity. It was a time when the feast was as much about spectacle as it was about eating, with meals lasting hours and involving dozens of courses for the elite. Meanwhile, the average peasant's diet was primarily gruel, bread, and if they were lucky, a bit of cheese or bacon. This morning routine isn't just a matter of who eats what. It's a reflection of the medieval world's rigid social structures. Your place in the food chain is determined by birth, not merit. It's a world that makes today's workplace hierarchies look positively egalitarian by comparison. So, as you sip your morning ale, and yes, they drank ale like it was water, because it was safer than the questionable stuff from the well, take a moment to appreciate the peculiar logic of medieval life. It's a time when the architectural marvels of the manor coexist with the harsh realities of drafty halls and rigid social norms. Quite the mixed bag, isn't it? But hey, at least you've got a front row seat to history. Just don't expect a warm one. As you finish your morning ale, trust me, it's better than well water, which is less refreshing and more medieval roulette. Let's get you acquainted with your new job description. Spoiler, it involves a lot of dirt and even more sweat. Welcome to the medieval manor's agricultural backbone, where every sunrise signals a day of back-breaking tasks. If you think your 9 to 5 is tough, wait until you meet the medieval farmer. These folks would look at your office woes and laugh, but not too hard. They're saving their energy for the plow. First up, a quick geography lesson on your workspace. The manor wasn't just a fancy house. It was a sprawling estate, often hundreds of acres. A typical manor might include around 200 acres, divided into arable land, meadow, woodland, and the demesne, the lord's private reserve. The demesne, typically about 1/3 of the manor, was where the lord flexed his agricultural muscles, with serfs doing the heavy lifting, of course. Manorialism, the economic system of the day, was like a well-oiled machine powered by the sweat of serfs. These folks were the backbone of the operation, bound to the land, and required to work the lord's demesne a few days a week. The rest of the time, they toiled on their own plots, which, incidentally, they didn't actually own. Serfs were essentially tenant farmers, paying for their little slice of medieval heaven with labor rather than cash. And speaking of labor, let's talk about what filled their days. Begin with a sunrise so early it should be illegal, and then head straight to the fields. Tilling the soil was a full-body workout that would make modern gym-goers weep. The heavy wooden plows used were a far cry from today's machinery, and they required both man and beast to operate. That's right, you and an ox were a team, and let's just say the ox wasn't always the most cooperative partner. Once the ploughing was done, it was time for sowing. This wasn't a leisurely stroll through the fields with a seed spreader. It was a manual affair involving scattering seeds by hand. Precision wasn't exactly the goal here. The idea was to cover as much ground as possible and hope the birds didn't see it as an all-you-can-eat buffet. But farming wasn't just about planting. There was livestock to consider. Tending to animals demanded constant attention, feeding, milking, shearing, and the less glamorous task of mucking out stalls. If you've ever thought your pet was a handful, try managing a herd of cattle or a flock of sheep. And in case you were worried about a lazy afternoon, there was always the harvest, a race against time and weather that required every available hand. This relentless cycle of labor was dictated by the seasons and the whims of Mother Nature. A bad harvest could spell disaster, leading to scarcity and hunger that made the modern concept of food insecurity seem almost quaint. It was a life of uncertainty, where the balance between feast and famine was as delicate as a medieval tapestry. Now, let's address the elephant, or ox, in the room, serfdom. These weren't free and easy farm gigs. Serfs were bound to the land and the whims of their lords. Their labor obligations, often 2 to 3 days a week on the demesne, were non-negotiable. In return, they were allowed to work their own plots, which might consist of about 30 acres, enough to keep a family fed if the harvest was kind. But don't let the rustic charm fool you. The economic reality was as harsh as the soil they tilled. Manorialism was a system designed to keep the lord's coffers full, while serfs eked out a living on the margins. This wasn't the romantic pastoral life of paintings and poems. It was grit and grind, with little room for upward mobility. The manor was a microcosm of medieval society, a world where status was as fixed as the stone walls of the great hall. In this feudal hierarchy, the lord was king of his own little kingdom, and the serfs, they were the workforce that kept it all running. Their labor was the glue that held the manorial economy together, a testament to the enduring power of hard work. But it was a work-life balance that would make today's office drones shudder. Forget weekends and paid leave. This was a life of toil, punctuated by the occasional feast day, which, let's face it, was more about religious obligation than relaxation. So, as you stand on this patch of earth, dirt under your nails and sweat on your brow, imagine the resilience it took to thrive in such a world. While you might long for the comforts of modern life, a warm bed, a hot shower, a weekend, remember that the medieval farmer had a different kind of strength. It was a life of endurance, of surviving and sometimes thriving despite the odds. And just like that, the day rolls on, the sun tracing a slow arc across the sky as you labor in its glow. Each hour brings a new challenge, a reminder that in this world, hard work was the only currency that mattered. But take heart, for in this land of toil and sweat, you're part of a story that's been told for centuries, a tale of labor, resilience, and the enduring human spirit. Just don't expect a break anytime soon. After all, history waits for no one, especially when there are fields to plow and crops to harvest. And as the sun reaches its zenith, you might think it's time for a leisurely midday break. Think again. In this medieval world, the concept of leisure is more of a fantasy than a reality. Sure, the lord might retire to his solar for a bit of respite, perhaps enjoying a goblet of imported wine, an indulgence that costs more than a peasant's annual income. But for the average serf, The only break involves swapping one grueling task for another slightly less back-breaking one. In medieval times, leisure was a luxury reserved for the upper echelons of society. For the common folk, the day was a relentless march from dawn till dusk, with only the briefest pauses for sustenance. Even then, meals were quick affairs, more about refueling than relaxing. A typical midday meal might consist of bread, cheese, and maybe a spart of ale if you were lucky. Remember, this wasn't the era of drive-thrus or lunch breaks. It was more of a grab what you can and keep moving scenario. But don't get too disheartened. There were still moments of joy and community, no matter how fleeting. Medieval folks found simple pleasures in music, storytelling, and games. Ever heard of knucklebones? It's a game that involved tossing and catching small bones. Think of it as medieval jacks, with a bit more grit and grime. And if you were really lucky, there might be a travelling minstrel passing through the village, providing a brief escape from the daily grind with tales of distant lands and heroic deeds. Let's not forget the local church, the cornerstone of medieval community life. Its influence was as pervasive as it was powerful, shaping everything from daily routines to moral codes. Churches weren't just places of worship. They were the heart of the village, where news was shared, disputes settled, and lives celebrated or mourned. The church bells dictated the rhythm of life, marking not just the hours but the very fabric of existence. From the Angelus at dawn to the Vespers at dusk, religion permeated every aspect of life, with the church exerting its influence over social norms and agricultural practices alike. Crop blessings were as important as the harvest itself, a divine insurance policy against the unpredictable whims of nature. And moral policing, you bet. The local priest wielded considerable power, ensuring that everyone adhered to the strict codes of conduct laid down by the church. Sin was a serious business, and penance could be both public and severe, from fasting to flogging. But before you dismiss the whole thing as a medieval buskill, consider this. These religious practices provided a sense of community and continuity in a world where uncertainty was the norm. The church was a constant, a place where life's milestones were marked and shared. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, these were communal events, weaving individual lives into the broader tapestry of the village. Now, let's talk festivals. The medieval festival, a rare and much anticipated respite from toil. These weren't your average backyard barbecues. Festivals were grand affairs, driven by the church calendar and the agricultural cycle. Think harvest festivals, saints' days, and of course, the granddaddy of them all, Easter. They provided a vital release valve for the pent-up stresses of medieval life, a chance for everyone to let loose and revel in a splash of color and chaos. Feasting was a major component, naturally, with tables groaning under the weight of meats, breads, and ales. It was a time when the rigid social barriers blurred ever so slightly, with lords dining alongside their tenants, a rare moment of shared humanity in a stratified world. Music, dancing, and games filled the day, while the evenings might see a bit of pageantry or a mystery play, courtesy of the local guilds. These festivals were a reminder that amidst the toil and hardship, there was a place for joy and celebration. But let's not completely romanticize the medieval festival. They were as much about maintaining social order as they were about merriment. The church and the lord of the manor both had a vested interest in ensuring the populace was content enough not to rebel. These festivals served as a pressure release, a way to keep the masses entertained and, crucially, in line. So as you stand in the midst of this medieval manor, you begin to see the delicate balance between work and play, the sacred and the secular. Leisure, such as it was, came wrapped in layers of duty and tradition, a fleeting glimpse of what life might be like beyond the toil. And while you might pine for modern comforts, remember that these medieval folks found their own ways to carve out moments of joy, whether through the rhythm of a song, the laughter of a game, or the fellowship of a festival. As the afternoon sun begins its slow descent, casting long shadows over the manor, you realize that these people lived a life dictated by forces both seen and unseen. Their days were a tapestry of labor and faith, laughter and law, woven together by the relentless march of time. So, while you might not last a day in a medieval manor, you can at least appreciate the resilience and resourcefulness of those who did, finding moments of light in a world often cloaked in shadow. Just remember, there's no rest for the weary. The fields await, and history, as always, marches on. As the twilight casts its mysterious glow over the manor, Let's dive into the murky waters of medieval politics, where allegiances changed faster than you can say feudal contract. Imagine a world where shaking hands could mean the difference between a peaceful life and a knock on your gate by some very unfriendly neighbors. The lord of the manor wasn't just some guy who lounged around in his great hall counting his sheep. No, Lord Grumpapants had responsibilities that stretched beyond his own stone walls, much like a modern CEO juggling boardroom politics, only with more swords involved. Let's start with the whole feudal system, that dizzying web of loyalty and land that kept medieval society ticking. Picture it as a giant game of Jenga, where each block is an oath or obligation. Pull the wrong one, and the whole thing comes crashing down. The lord of your manor didn't own his land outright. Instead, he held it as a vassal under a liege lord who might himself be a vassal to someone higher up the chain. It's a bit like a medieval pyramid scheme, but instead of questionable financial returns, you got military protection and a chance to play the Game of Thrones, minus the dragons, and with a lot more mud. Now, when it comes to these oaths, think of them as the medieval equivalent of pinky promises, but with a lot more at stake. The lord swore fealty to his liege, pledging military support and counsel in exchange for land and protection. It was a relationship built on mutual need, trust, and the understanding that breaking your word might earn you a free trip to the gallows. These oaths were as binding as a modern legal contract, only without the small print. Instead, they had something far more binding: honor. Yes, in a world where social media didn't exist to call out your failures, your word was your bond, and losing face could mean losing everything. But it wasn't all about who promised what to whom. The political landscape was as volatile as a medieval cauldron, bubbling over with potential conflicts. Lords were constantly on guard for threats both external and internal. Neighboring manors weren't always the friendly types. Disputes over land were as common as peas in your pottage. And let's not forget the internal strife. Power struggles within the manor could ignite like a powder keg at a fireworks show. A disgruntled vassal or ambitious steward could make life very interesting, very quickly. In this world of shifting loyalties, alliances were as crucial as they were fragile. Marriages were less about love and more about strategic mergers. If you were a lord, your daughter's hand in marriage was like a medieval IPO. A good match could strengthen ties with a powerful neighbor, adding another layer of protection to your manor. But a bad match, well, that could spell disaster, leading to feuds that lasted generations. It was less about wedding bells and more about wedding bells with benefits, land, troops, and hopefully fewer enemies. Then there were the ever-present threats of rebellion and betrayal, the consequences of which were often swift and brutal. A lord needed to keep his vassals happy, or at least content enough not to stab him in the back. This meant fair treatment, just enough leniency, and perhaps the occasional feast to remind everyone who's boss. But even the savviest lord couldn't predict every betrayal. Sometimes, a trusted ally could turn foe overnight, tempted by promises of land and power from a rival lord. It was a world where trust was as rare as a dragon sighting, and loyalty could shift with the wind. Let's not forget the looming shadow of warfare, a constant threat that made medieval life feel like one long episode of Survivor. Lords were expected to muster their own knights and soldiers, ready to defend their lands or join their liege lord in battle a moment's notice. This wasn't a hobby, it was a duty, and failing to fulfill it could lead to dire consequences, including the loss of your fief, or worse. The cost of maintaining a fighting force was steep, with armor, weapons, and horses eating up a significant chunk of resources. Think of it as the medieval version of defense spending, where the stakes were as high as the walls you built around your manor. And speaking of defense, let's talk fortifications. The manor's stone walls weren't just there to look pretty. They were a bulwark against invaders, but building and maintaining them was no small feat. It required a hefty investment in manpower and materials. Stone didn't come cheap, and the labor to quarry, transport, and assemble it was intense. But a well-fortified manor was worth its weight in gold, or at least in peace of mind. It was like having the best home security system money could buy, only with less tech and more trebuchets. As dusk settles, casting its cloak over the rolling fields and stone structures, you can almost feel the weight of history pressing down. The political intrigue of the manor wasn't just a backdrop to medieval life. It was the very air these people breathed. the daily drama that unfolded in shadowed corridors and across battle-scarred lands. It was a time when a single decision could alter the course of entire regions overnight, where alliances and betrayals were the currency of power. But as we leave the Lord to his plots and plans, remember this: while you might be grateful for the stability of modern governance, there's a certain thrill to the unpredictability of feudal politics. It was a world where power was always up for grabs, where every handshake could be your last, and where history was written not by the victors, but by those who dared to play the game. So, as the stars begin to twinkle above, take a moment to appreciate the complex dance of medieval power, a dance that continues to echo through the ages, even if the music has changed. As the stars twinkle above, and the political intrigue of the day settles into the background, the manor transitions into its evening rituals, a time less about plotting and more about finding solace in the simple pleasures of life. Picture this: the great hall, a cavernous space by day, now aglow with the flicker of candlelight. It's a scene that might seem quaintly romantic, but let's not forget the medieval reality. A drafty expanse where that flickering light barely holds a candle, pun intended, to the modern convenience of a light switch. The hearth, the centerpiece of the evening, crackles with the rare indulgence of a warm fire. In a time when firewood was as precious as gold, a roaring fire was a luxury not to be taken lightly. Imagine the logistics: gathering, chopping, and storing wood, all labor-intensive tasks. This wasn't just about warmth, it was about survival. In fact, a single manor might go through several tons of wood each winter, enough to make even the most committed lumberjack break a sweat. Gathered around this precious source of light and warmth, the manor's inhabitants engage in an age-old tradition: storytelling. These tales are not mere entertainment, they're the Netflix of their time, a way to escape the harsh realities of medieval life. From epic sagas of knights and dragons to cautionary tales of greed and betrayal, these stories weave the fabric of community, connecting generations through shared narratives. It's a tradition that underscores a universal truth: humans have always craved stories, whether told by flickering firelight or streamed on a digital screen. Music, too, plays a significant role in the evening's activities. With no Spotify or vinyl records, people made their own music. Lutes, fiddles, and the occasional bagpipe set the scene for communal singing and dancing. It's a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a refusal to let the daily grind strip away joy. And let's face it, anyone who's tried to master an instrument can appreciate the skill involved. These musicians were the rock stars of their day, their tunes as familiar to the manor's residents as the latest chart toppers are to us. These evening gatherings are about more than just entertainment. They're about forging bonds and creating a sense of belonging. In a world where life was often brutish and short, community was everything. The manor was not just an economic unit, but a social one, where mutual support was vital. Imagine a network of relationships as intricate as a medieval tapestry, each thread essential to the whole. Whether through marriage, shared labor, or communal feasting, these ties were the bedrock of survival. But let's dispel some myths about medieval happiness and resilience. The romantic notion of contented peasants living simple, fulfilled lives under the benevolent gaze of their lord is frankly a fairy tale. Medieval life was harsh, and happiness was often a fleeting luxury. Disease, famine, and warfare were constant companions, painting a stark picture that contrasts with the idyllic scenes of pastoral life often depicted in art and literature. Resilience, then, was less about choice and more about necessity. The people of the manor were masters of adaptation, finding ways to endure despite the odds. They built communities not out of idealism, but out of sheer need. Social bonds were forged in the crucible of hardship, creating networks that could withstand the pressures of medieval life. It's a resilience born not of joy, but of grit and determination, a truth that strips away the romantic veneer to reveal the raw human spirit beneath. As our day in the manor draws to a close, it's worth reflecting on the legacy of this bygone era. Medieval manors were the building blocks of European society, a microcosm of the broader economic and social structures that shaped history. They were places where the past and future met, where tradition and change danced a delicate waltz. The lessons they offer are timeless: the importance of community, the power of storytelling, and the resilience that comes from facing adversity together. So, as you snuggle into your modern bed, perhaps with a Netflix series queued up, take a moment to appreciate the comfort and convenience of the present. Remember that the people of the medieval manor lived without the luxuries we take for granted, yet they found ways to connect, to celebrate, and to endure. Their lives, though distant in time, echo with the same desires and dreams that drive us today. And while you might not last a day in their world, their stories and their spirit continue to resonate, to remind us of the enduring power of human resilience and community. 15th century France was a place where chaos was a constant companion, and the politics could make a soap opera look like a calm day at the beach. The 100 Years' War was in full swing, though it really should have been called the 100 and some change Years' War, since it stretched from 1337 to 1453, 116 years, in case you're counting. This epic squabble was France versus England, a rematch of sorts after the Norman conquest. It was like a medieval version of Who Wants to Be King, with far fewer lifelines and a lot more beheadings. Enter Joan of Arc, who wasn't exactly born with a sword in her hand, but rather in the sleepy village of Domremy around January 6, 1412. Domremy was the kind of place where even the cows probably found the gossip a bit dull. Yet, this village nestled in the northeastern part of France, in the Duchy of Bar, was about to become ground zero for one of the most incredible stories in history. Joan, or Jehan, as she was known in the local tongue, grew up in a humble peasant family. Her dad, Jacques d'Arc, was a farmer, and her mom, Isabelle Remay, worked to keep the family fed and clothed, which was no small feat during a time when famine was as common as bad weather forecasts. Joan had 3 brothers and a sister, and together they navigated the ups and downs of rural life, which mostly involved a lot of downs. We're talking about an era when the Black Death had recently wiped out 1/3 of Europe's population, just to add a little extra gloom to the medieval mood. But young Joan, she had something different. Before she was old enough to know better, she started hearing voices. Now, for most medieval parents, this would be a cue to call the local exorcist, or maybe keep the kid away from the fermented apple juice. But Joan insisted these voices were divine, and who was going to argue with a teenager about what they heard in their head? She claimed she received messages from saints, Michael, Catherine, and Margaret, to be precise. The saints apparently had a lot to say about saving France and crowning Charles Roman VII, the Dauphin, as king. You know, the usual teenage daydreams. The political scene was a hot mess. Charles VI of France, known as Charles the Mad, was having bouts of insanity that made for a pretty unstable monarchy. Meanwhile, Henry V of England was busy claiming chunks of French real estate like it was a game of Monopoly, and he had the get-out-of-jail-free card. When Henry V died in 1422, the English crown passed to his infant son, Henry VI, which only added diapers to the list of royal court concerns. And while the English were busy juggling crowns, the French were embroiled in a civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. It was like a family feud on steroids, with the Armagnacs supporting the Dauphin Charles and the Burgundians siding with the English. In the middle of this power struggle, the French countryside was getting ravaged like it was the world's least fun piñata party. So, when Joan started proclaiming that she was on a mission from God to boot out the English and coronate Charles, it was a bold move. The Dauphin Charles was holed up in Chinon, a town on the Loire River, probably wondering if his royal title came with a refund policy. Joan managed to convince a local garrison commander to escort her to meet him. Keep in mind, this was a time when a peasant girl going to speak with royalty was like a modern-day teen getting a meeting with the president because her cat told her it was a good idea. In 1429, Joan finally made it to Chinon, and her audience with Charles was as legendary as it was improbable. She was about 17, dressed in men's clothing because practicality sometimes outweighs fashion, especially when you're riding hundreds of miles on horseback. Her meeting with Charles is shrouded in legend, with tales of her identifying him in disguise and whispering secrets only he could know. Myths or not, she convinced him to give her the chance to lead his army to lift the siege of Orleans. And just like that, a teenager with a divine calling was handed the reins of a military force, which was probably the last thing anyone expected from a day in the life of 15th century France. Next up, Joan would have to prove she wasn't all talk and no action. But for now, She got the chance to turn the tide in a war that seemed destined to drag on longer than a medieval ballad. The stage was set, the players were in place, and Joan of Arc was about to step into history with the kind of entrance that would make any Hollywood director proud. So, Joan of Arc found herself handed the reins of an army, and there was no time to waste. The French forces were about as organized as a medieval bake sale, and morale was at rock bottom. Enter Joan, with her armor that screamed peasant chic meets knight in shining armor, ready to kick English rear ends and take names. Why did Charles Roman VII, the Dauphin, gamble on a teenage girl with visions? Desperation, my friend, is a powerful motivator when you're hanging by a thread in a war that's been dragging on like a bad dinner party. Let's set the scene. The year was 1429, and the city of Orleans was under siege by the English. If Orleans fell, it was game over for Charles Roman VII, and he'd probably have to update his LinkedIn to former Dauphin, current unemployed royal. The English had set up camp around the city like they were planning an extended vacation, complete with fortifications and a non-stop supply of arrows. Meanwhile, the inhabitants of Orleans were getting as anxious as cats in a room full of rocking chairs, knowing their days were numbered. Joan wasn't about to let Orleans become the medieval version of a ghost town. She jumped into action with the enthusiasm of a teenager who just got their first smartphone. Her plan: lead the French forces to break the siege and show the English that France wasn't just a tasty morsel to be chewed on. Joan's presence alone was like a shot of adrenaline to the French troops. She had a way of turning skepticism into hope, like a motivational speaker who actually had some divine backing. Now, let's talk about Joan's famous suit of armor. This wasn't just any metal get-up. It was custom-made, weighing around 50 pounds, and probably cost the equivalent of a few years' worth of a peasant's wages. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a bespoke suit, minus the pocket square. But Joan wore it with the confidence of someone who knew it was far more than just protection. It was a symbol that she meant business. And let's be honest, when a teenage girl puts on armor and rides into battle, it's hard not to be impressed. When Joan reached Orleans, she didn't just sit around waiting for a miracle. She took charge like a general who'd been doing this for decades, not days. One of her first moves was sending a letter to the English commanders, demanding they pack up and leave. The English, of course, were more amused than intimidated, but Joan wasn't the type to back down. Her divine pep talks, delivered with the fervor of someone who'd been practicing her speech in front of a mirror, rallied the French troops. She convinced them that they were fighting not just for land, but for their very souls. The turning point came on May 4, 1429, when Joan led a daring assault on the English-held fortress of St. Loup. Picture this: a teenage girl leading seasoned warriors into battle with her banner flying high. It was the kind of scene that would make even the most skeptical soldier believe in a higher power. The French captured the fortress, and the tide began to turn. Joan's presence was like a jolt of electricity to the French forces, and suddenly victory didn't seem so impossible. Over the next few days, Joan continued to lead attacks with the determination of someone who truly believed she had guard on speed dial. She was wounded during one assault, but that didn't stop her. In fact, it only seemed to fuel her determination. By May 8, the English lifted the siege and retreated. Orleans was saved, and Joan's reputation skyrocketed faster than a medieval gossip column could keep up. Joan of Arc had transformed from an oddity to a national sensation, the kind of rise to fame that would make today's influencers green with envy. She became a symbol of hope, a beacon of divine intervention in a world where the line between heaven and earth seemed to blur. Her success at Orleans was more than just a military victory. It was a psychological one. It proved that the French could actually stand up to the English and win, and it gave Charles Roman VII the boost he needed to start thinking about that long-awaited coronation. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. While Joan's star was rising, the political landscape was still as treacherous as ever. Charles Roman VII, though grateful for Joan's help, was still a dauphin without a crown, and the English weren't about to pack up and leave France just because a teenage girl told them to. The road to victory was still long and twisted, with more battles, betrayals, and the kind of medieval drama that would keep a modern-day soap opera in business for years. In the meantime, Joan of Arc was riding high on her victory at Orleans, with the eyes of France and England firmly fixed on her next move. She was a force of nature, a whirlwind of determination and faith, and her journey was far from over. As France watched, Joan was poised to change the course of history, one battle at a time. But that's a story for another day, as the legend of Joan of Arc continued to unfold with all the unpredictability of a medieval plot twist. With Orleans saved, and Joan of Arc riding high on her newfound celebrity status, the next logical step was to get Charles Roman VII that crown he'd been dreaming of. You see, back in the day, a king without a coronation was like a knight without a horse, technically passable, but not particularly impressive. The French needed something to rally around, and a properly crowned king was just the ticket. But getting to Rheims, where the coronation was traditionally held, was no walk in the park. It was more like a treacherous hike through enemy territory, with the English and their Burgundian buddies controlling large swaths of land. To pull off this grand procession, Joan had to channel her inner logistics manager, coordinating a military campaign that would make even the most seasoned strategist break a sweat. Let's not forget the absurdities of medieval warfare logistics. Picture this. Moving an army in the 15th century was less of a strategic maneuver and more of an exercise in patience. Armies were like traveling circuses, complete with knights, foot soldiers, horses, and enough camp followers to populate a small town. Supplies were often scarce, and the roads, if you could call them that, were little more than muddy trails. The whole operation was a bit like trying to herd cats in a thunderstorm. But Joan, ever the determined teenager, wasn't one to be deterred by a little mud and chaos. She played her role to perfection, blending divine inspiration with practical strategy. Her ability to motivate the troops was legendary. She turned the journey to Rheims into a morale-boosting road trip, complete with the medieval equivalent of pep rallies and battle hymns. Her strategic savvy was evident as she deftly navigated political alliances and military logistics, proving that she could have made a killing in the corporate world had she been born a few centuries later. Meanwhile, Charles Roman VII was probably trying to wrap his head around the fact that his path to the throne was being paved by a teenage girl who claimed to chat with saints. The French court, a place where intrigue was as common as bread and wine, was abuzz with rumors and speculation. Was Joan truly sent by God, or was she just a lucky charm riding the wave of her Orleans victory? Either way, her presence was a game-changer, and Charles was wise enough to play along. The journey to Rheims was a masterclass in medieval logistics. Joan and her entourage had to travel over 350 kilometers, roughly the distance of New York to Washington, D.C., but with fewer highways and more hostile forces. It was less of a direct route and more of a zigzag through contested territories, avoiding English strongholds like a game of medieval hopscotch. Along the way, Joan's presence continued to inspire both soldiers and civilians, her legend growing with every step. Now, let's talk armor. Medieval armor was the fashion statement of the battlefield, but comfortable it was not. Joan's suit, while impressive, was about as cozy as a steel corset. We're talking about a get-up that weighed as much as a small child and restricted movement like a poorly designed yoga outfit. Yet, Joan donned it like it was the latest trend from Paris, proving that when it comes to style, sometimes you've just got to suffer for your art. Finally, on July 17, 1429, Joan and her crew rolled into Rheims, ready to make history. The coronation of Charles Roman VII was a spectacle worthy of any modern-day PR campaign. The cathedral was packed with nobles, clergy, and enough pomp and circumstance to rival a royal wedding. Joan, standing by Charles's side, was the star of the show, her presence a testament to the power of faith and determination. The ceremony itself was a mix of religious solemnity and political theatre. Charles was anointed with holy oil, a tradition dating back to the time of Clovis, the first king of the Franks. The oil, said to have been brought by a dove from heaven, because medieval legends never did subtle, was a symbol of divine right and legitimacy. For Charles, the ceremony was a much-needed boost to his royal credentials. For Joan, it was a vindication of her divine mission. But while the coronation was a triumph, it was by no means the end of the story. The English weren't about to pack up and leave just because Charles had finally put a crown on his head. The war was still raging, and Joan's role was far from over. Her success at Rheims was a turning point, but it also marked the beginning of a new set of challenges and trials. In the grand scheme of things, Joan's influence at Rhymes was a testament to her ability to blend faith with strategy. She had managed to turn what could have been a dull political ritual into a rallying cry for nation. It was a masterstroke of medieval PR, one that would echo through the ages as a symbol of hope and resilience. As Joan continued her journey, she remained a figure of fascination and controversy. Her meteoric rise was both a blessing and a burden, and the road ahead was fraught with danger and intrigue. But for now, she was the hero of the hour, a beacon of light in the dark days of the 100 Years' War, and her legend was far from finished. So, there we leave Joan, basking in the glory of her latest triumph, but with the weight of destiny still heavy on her shoulders. The stage was set for the next chapter in her incredible journey, one that would test her resolve and redefine her legacy in ways that even she could not have imagined. Stay tuned, because the story of Joan of Arc is just getting started, and the best, or perhaps the most tragic, is yet to come. As Joan basked in the glow of her triumph at Rhymes, the pressures of medieval stardom began to close in like a siege of their own. The coronation of Charles Roman VII was hardly the happy ending one might hope for. Instead, it set the stage for a gripping drama where the stakes were as high as a medieval tower, and the players as sharp as a knight's lance. Now, let's dive into the murky waters of Joan's capture and subsequent trial, a tale replete with enough intrigue and betrayal to make Shakespeare's plays look like bedtime stories. You see, Joan's downfall was less about divine misfortune and more about the pragmatic realities of 15th century politics. Her capture on May 23, 1430, near the town of Compiègne, was as inevitable as a rainstorm in Normandy, given the tangled web of alliances and enmities she'd navigated. The Burgundians, those charming allies of the English, nabbed Joan in a skirmish that was less epic battle and more cat-and-mouse chase. For 10,000 livres tournois, a sum that would make any medieval accountant swoon, they handed her over to the English. That's right, folks, Joan was sold out for what would be about 5 million euros today. It turns out, even in the Middle Ages, the right price could buy you anything, including a national hero. Once in English hands, Joan was dragged through a trial that was about as fair and balanced as a seesaw with a hippo on one end. The English needed to discredit her, to turn her from a divinely inspired warrior into a heretic and a witch. And why? Because if Joan was legitimate, then Charles Roman VII coronation was divinely sanctioned, and all those English claims to the French throne were about as valuable as a wooden crown. Enter Bishop Pierre Courchon, the man with a name that sounds suspiciously like pig, which might be fate's little joke, considering his role in this kangaroo court. Courchon, a man with ambitions as lofty as a cathedral and morals as shaky as a rickety bridge, spearheaded the trial. His loyalty to the English was as deep as his pockets. He had an agenda to ensure Joan was found guilty, thereby stripping her of her saintly aura and by extension delegitimizing Charles Roman VII. The trial, which began on January 9, 1431, was less about justice and more about spectacle. Picture a courtroom drama where the verdict was preordained and the defense attorney was conveniently missing. Joan was grilled on everything from her visions to her choice of attire, because, apparently, cross-dressing was a bigger sin than, say, waging war. Joan held her ground with a tenacity that would make any modern-day lawyer proud. Despite being denied legal counsel and facing a tribunal that was about as impartial as a biased referee, she answered with clarity and conviction. Her famous retort, "I am not afraid, for God is with me," rings through history as a testament to her unyielding faith. But faith, as it turned out, is a poor match for the machinations of men with political axes to grind. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the whole witchcraft thing. It was the Middle Ages, a time when any woman who didn't fit neatly into society's little box was at risk of being labeled a witch. Joan's visions and military success were painted as evidence of sorcery, a convenient narrative that allowed her enemies to paint her as a dangerous anomaly rather than a divinely inspired leader. The truth, though, was that Joan's supposed witchcraft was little more than a smokescreen, a way to justify the political necessity of her downfall. By May 1431, the inevitable conclusion of this farce of a trial was reached. Joan was declared guilty of heresy and sentenced to death. The trial's outcome was less about religious transgressions and more about silencing a symbol that had become too powerful to ignore. Her execution was scheduled for May 30, and she was to be burned at the stake in Rouen, a city that would forever bear the mark of her martyrdom. The economic and political motivations behind Joan's trial were as transparent as a castle's stained glass window. The English and their allies needed to undermine the legitimacy of her achievements to maintain their claim over French territory. Joan was a pawn in a larger game, one where the lines between faith and politics blurred into a murky shade of grey. In the end, Joan of Arc's trial and execution were less about justice and more about power and control. Her story serves as a stark reminder of how politics can distort truth, how powerful men can bend the narrative to serve their own ends. Yet, even in death, Joan's legacy was far from extinguished. Her martyrdom would ignite a flame that burned brighter than any pyre, a symbol of resilience and faith that would echo through the ages. But hold that thought, because Joan's tale isn't done weaving its complex tapestry just yet. Her posthumous journey offers another chapter in the saga, one that would eventually see her vindicated and canonized, long after the smoke from her execution had cleared. So stay tuned as we peel back more layers of this historical onion, exploring the aftermath of Joan's death and her enduring impact on both France and the broader world. Joan of Arc's story didn't end with the crackling of flames in Rouen. It was merely the beginning of a posthumous chapter that would see her rise from the ashes like a medieval phoenix. Enter the retrial of 1456, a sort of historical do-over that came courtesy of Charles Roman VII, the very king Joan had helped crown. Now, let's be real. This wasn't just a belated act of chivalry. It was a politically savvy move by Charles to clear his own name, because his legitimacy had taken a hit when his chief miracle worker was branded a heretic. You could say he was motivated by a mix of guilt and political necessity, which is as good a cocktail as any to get things moving in 15th century France. The retrial, officially known as the nullification trial, was a bureaucratic behemoth, spanning over 6 months and involving hundreds of witnesses who came forward to testify that Joan was, indeed, a saintly figure wronged by a rigged system. Think of it as the medieval version of a true crime podcast, complete with interviews, dramatic recounts, and the occasional gasp-inducing revelation. The verdict. Joan's original trial was declared a sham, her conviction nullified, and she was posthumously acquitted of all charges. It was a legal resurrection, the kind that would have made any Renaissance lawyer proud. But why did this matter? Well, beyond the legal niceties, it was about restoring national pride. By 1456, France was emerging from the shadow of the 100 Years' War, and Joan became the ultimate symbol of French resilience, a rallying cry for a nation piecing itself back together. Her vindication was a reminder that even in a world dominated by power-hungry men and political machinations, the truth could still win out, eventually. Fast forward a few centuries, and Joan of Arc's reputation was due for another polish. Into the 19th century, a period when nationalism was the new black, and every country wanted a historical figure to pin their hopes and dreams on. France was no different, and Joan was the perfect candidate. She was transformed from a medieval oddity into a full-blown national icon, the kind of figure you'd see plastered on posters, statues, and maybe even a few patriotic T-shirts had they existed back then. In 1920, the Catholic Church got in on the action, officially canonizing Joan as a saint. It was a long-overdue recognition that came nearly 500 years after she'd been barbecued for heresy. The canonization was a global event, proving that if you wait long enough, history might just forgive you for wearing men's clothes and claiming to hear voices. Joan's sainthood sealed her legacy, turning her into a symbol not just of French pride, but of universal courage and faith. Now, let's talk lasting impact. Joan of Arc's story is like a historical Swiss Army knife. It's got a bit of everything for everyone. For France, she remains a symbol of national unity, a beacon of hope in times when the chips are down. Her story serves as a reminder that even the most unlikely heroes can change the course of history, which is a comforting thought in a world that often feels like a chaotic medieval fair. But Joan's influence isn't confined to the borders of France. Her tale has reverberated around the globe, inspiring countless interpretations in literature, film, and art. She's been portrayed as everything from a devout religious figure to a proto-feminist icon, a testament to her ability to transcend time and speak to generations beyond her own. In a way, Joan's story is the ultimate underdog narrative, proving that sometimes the ones who seem most insignificant can have the loudest voices. And let's not ignore the feminist angle. Joan of Arc has been embraced by feminist movements worldwide as a symbol of female empowerment, a woman who defied the rigid gender norms of her time and rode into battle with the confidence of someone who'd never heard the word impossible. Her courage in the face of overwhelming odds continues to inspire women everywhere to challenge societal constraints and forge their own paths. So, what can we learn from the tale of Joan of Arc? Perhaps it's that history's narratives are as fluid as the Seine, constantly reshaping themselves to fit the needs and values of the present. Joan's legacy is a reminder that while the world can be harsh and unforgiving, there is always room for redemption, for stories to be retold and reimagined in ways that resonate anew. In the end, Joan of Arc's story proves that history's underdogs often have the last laugh. Despite the trials, the betrayals, and the flames, her legend endures, a testament to the power of conviction and the enduring human spirit. And as we look back on her life, we're reminded that even in the darkest times, there's a glimmer of light, a chance for redemption, and the possibility of a happy ending, even if it takes a few centuries to get there. Marie Curie's early life was a classic underdog story, but instead of a rags-to-riches arc, it was more like a rags-to-radioactive elements saga. Born Maria Skłodowska on November 7, 1867, in Warsaw, Poland, her childhood was a cocktail of brilliance and adversity. Poland was under Russian dominance, and the air was thick with the scent of rebellion and boiled cabbage. Her parents, both educators, instilled in her a love of learning and a deep distrust of imperialism, skills that would come in handy in both science and life. Now, being a brainiac in a nation where speaking your mind could land you in hot water, or worse, Siberia, was no small feat. Maria was so sharp she could slice bread with her wit. But as it often goes, brilliance doesn't pay the bills, and her family was financially strapped. Her father, a mathematics and physics teacher, lost his savings in a bad investment, leaving the family in a financial pickle. There were 5 Skłodowska kids, and Maria was the youngest, which meant hand-me-downs and the last dibs on pierogi. And yet, Maria excelled in school. Her grades were higher than a kite in a wind tunnel, but being a woman in 19th century Poland meant higher education was a pipe dream. The University of Warsaw was a no-go for women, so she and her sister Bronislawa hatched a plan as cunning as any Cold War spy thriller. They would study clandestinely at the Flying University, an illegal institution that moved locations to avoid Russian detection. Picture it, students sneaking around the city like intellectual ninjas, books tucked under their arms instead of nunchucks. But the sisters had bigger dreams and their sights set on Paris, the city of lights, quasars, and most importantly, education. Bronislawa went first, studying medicine, and once settled, Maria would join her. Not exactly a sister act, but more of a sister pact. To fund this scheme, Maria worked as a governess, a job that was the 19th century equivalent of babysitting, but with more algebra. She spent years saving her zlotys, which meant scrimping and saving, all while dodging the amorous advances of a young man whose intentions were as clear as a Warsaw fog. When she finally made it to Paris in 1891, Maria became Marie, because apparently the French think everything sounds better with a little je ne sais quoi. She enrolled at the Sorbonne, where the gender ratio was about as balanced as a seesaw with an elephant on one side. In a sea of male students, Marie was a rare pearl, but pearls don't pay the rent. So she rented a freezing attic room that was part student lodging, part cryogenic chamber. Her diet was the stuff of nightmares for modern dietitians: bread, butter, and tea, with the occasional egg thrown in for good measure. If she was feeling particularly flush, she might splash out on a bit of meat, but let's not get carried away. Marie was so dedicated to her studies that she often forgot to eat, a habit that would make any Polish grandmother clutch her chest in horror. Legend has it she developed a taste for cold coffee, probably because she was too busy calculating to notice it had gone tepid. But let's be real. She wasn't sipping artisanal lattes in a hipster cafe. Her beverage of choice was more likely a murky brew that doubled as paint stripper. Despite the odds, Marie crushed her exams like a steamroller over a potato. In 1893, she earned a degree in physics, being placed first in her class. A year later, she added a mathematics degree to her collection, finishing second. She was a one-woman academic powerhouse, a fact that was as impressive as it was unusual. The Sorbonne was no Hogwarts, but if it had been, Marie would have been the Gryffindor Quidditch captain, head of the dueling club, and valedictorian, all rolled into one. Marie Curie's early experiences were not just about overcoming obstacles. They were about forging a path where none existed. Her story is a reminder that brilliance is not an exclusive club. It doesn't care about your gender, your bank balance, or your accent. It's about the drive to keep learning, even when your coffee's cold and your room's colder. And as Marie would go on to prove, sometimes that's enough to change the world, one radioactive element at a time. With her academic triumphs tucked securely under her belt, Marie Curie was on a quest for the next big thing, like a scientist with a taste for adventure instead of Indiana Jones's hat. Enter stage left, Pierre Curie, a fellow physicist whose interests aligned with Marie's like a perfectly calibrated equation. The two met in 1894, and it was a classic case of geek love at first sight. Mutual admiration for each other's brains, with a side of romantic chemistry. By 1895, they were married, and let's just say their honeymoon was less about sunsets on the Seine and more about lab work under the Paris moonlight. Together, the Curies embarked on a scientific journey that would make any alchemist green with envy. They were determined to unravel the mysteries of radioactivity, a term Marie herself coined, because who else would get to name the magic they were about to unleash? Their research began with a humble mineral known as pitchblende. Now, pitchblende sounds like something you'd find in the villain's lair in a superhero flick, but this unassuming, uranium-rich ore was about to make history. Picture this: Marie and Pierre, clad not in lab coats, but in everyday clothes, slaving away in what can only be described as a glorified garden shed. This wasn't your typical scientific laboratory. It was more of a cross between a garage sale and a medieval alchemist's den. The building was originally a disused medical school storeroom, lacking in both modern amenities and basic ventilation. The Curies spent long hours there, cooking pitchblende in iron cauldrons like a pair of potion masters working on the ultimate elixir. Their work was as grueling as it was groundbreaking. They processed tons, yes, literal tons, of pitchblende, all in the name of extracting a few tiny specks of something far more precious than gold. It was back-breaking labor, and if there was a Nobel Prize for manual endurance, they would have won that too. The duo's methods were so low-tech that at any moment you half expected a Monty Python sketch to break out. Despite the conditions, Marie and Pierre discovered not one but two new elements: polonium, named after Marie's beloved Poland, and the glow-in-the-dark superstar radium. Radium was the real showstopper here. With its ghostly luminescence, it captivated the public's imagination like a radioactive firefly in a jar. People were enchanted by its eerie glow, unaware that it was more of a Pandora's box than a magic lamp. It was the 19th century's version of a viral sensation, a kind of chemist's catnip that had everyone buzzing. Little did they know, this fascination would lead to an entire industry of radium-infused products, from toothpaste to Clark faces, pitching radium as a miracle cure-all with a side of sparkle. Meanwhile, the Curies were crunching numbers and crunching pitchblende, oblivious to how their discoveries would light up not just their lab, but the world. They were the original power couple, not in the celebrity sense, but in the let's change the course of science way. Their findings shook the foundations of physics and chemistry, proving that atoms were not the smallest indivisible units of matter as previously thought. The atomic age was dawning, and Marie and Pierre were its heralds, armed with nothing but curiosity, perseverance, and a whole lot of pitchblende. Despite their successes, the Curies were not exactly rolling in cash. Funding was a perennial issue, and their lab was more DIY than state-of-the-art. Their equipment was cobbled together from whatever they could scrounge up, making Mac Jiver look like an amateur. But this resourcefulness only added to the legend. It was the ultimate underdog story, with Marie and Pierre as the scrappy scientists taking on the scientific establishment with little more than determination and a healthy disregard for safety protocols. Their work wasn't without risk, and hindsight is 20/20, especially when it comes to radiation exposure. The Curies handled radium with the same nonchalance one might reserve for handling eggs at breakfast, blissfully unaware of its dangers. They marveled at the element's glow, likely unaware that it was the scientific equivalent of juggling lit dynamite. It's a darkly humorous paradox. The very thing that made radium so enchanting was also what made it so deadly. Marie and Pierre's research was a labor of love, but it came at a cost. Pierre's health began to decline, likely due to prolonged exposure to radiation, though the connection was not made at the time. In 1903, the couple, along with Henry Becquerel, was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics. Marie became the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, smashing through yet another glass ceiling with the force of a nuclear explosion. This recognition brought them some financial relief, but more importantly, it solidified their place in scientific history. Curie's story is a mix of myth and reality, shining as brightly as the radium they discovered. They were pioneers, navigating uncharted territories with little more than a map of their own making. Their legacy is not just in the elements they uncovered, but in the spirit of inquiry and determination they embodied. As Marie would eventually discover, changing the world is not a solo mission, but a collaborative effort fraught with trials, triumphs, and the occasional radioactive glow. Stay tuned, because the story of Marie Curie is far from over. There are more elements to uncover, both literal and figurative, in the fascinating saga of science, sacrifice, and the pursuit of knowledge. As the legacy of the Curies glistened like radium in the public eye, the stories surrounding Marie Curie began to take on a life of their own. It was as if the world had collectively decided to turn her into a scientific superhero, complete with the power to glow in the dark. Marie's Nobel Prize victories in 1903 and later in 1911 for chemistry, making her the first and only person to snag Nobels in 2 different sciences, cemented her status as a trailblazer. But when the legend becomes fact, print the legend right. Well, not so fast. Let's dive into the myth-making machine that spun Marie's story into a glittering tapestry. First up, the tale of Marie Curie as the solitary scientist, toiling away in her lab like a lone alchemist. It's a narrative as romantic as it is misleading. In reality, science is more of a team sport than a solo act. Sure, Marie was a powerhouse of intellect and innovation, but she didn't work in a vacuum. Her lab was a bustling hub of activity, filled with students and collaborators. Yes, she was the star player, but she had a pretty strong supporting cast. And then there's the myth of the radiant Marie, glowing with the light of her discoveries. It's true that Marie was fascinated by the luminescent properties of radium, and she even carried a vial of the stuff in her pocket. Talk about living on the edge. But the idea that she herself glowed with an ethereal light, that's more science fiction than science fact. Her glow was metaphorical, not literal, and thank goodness for that. Otherwise, we'd be talking about Marie Curie, the human glow stick. Yet, the public was enamored with radium, and it wasn't long before the element was marketed like a miracle elixir. Radium-infused products promised to cure everything from arthritis to impotence, all with the added bonus of a celestial shimmer. It was the early 20th century equivalent of a dubious wellness trend, and people were lapping it up. Radium water, anyone. It was advertised as liquid sunshine, which is ironic considering it was more like liquid kryptonite. But let's not forget the economic landscape that fueled both the fascination and the folly. Back in the 1900s, science was a burgeoning industry, and radium was its poster child. The stuff was as valuable as platinum, fetching around $100,000 per gram in today's money. It was the Bitcoin of its day, an investment opportunity that seemed too good to pass up. Little did investors know, they were buying into a radioactive time bomb. Amidst this economic frenzy, Marie Curie was navigating a world that wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for women in science. The early 20th century wasn't exactly a bastion of gender equality. In fact, the scientific community was about as welcoming to women as a porcupine in a balloon factory. Marie's achievements were groundbreaking, not just for the discoveries themselves, but for the social barriers they shattered. Her success was a beacon of hope in a field dominated by men, but it also came with its share of skepticism and scrutiny. Some contemporaries questioned whether she was truly the brains behind her discoveries, a notion as absurd as doubting if Einstein knew his relativity from his elbow. The gender dynamics of the time meant that Marie's fame was a double-edged sword. On one hand, she was celebrated as a pioneer, a symbol of what women could achieve in the sciences. On the other, she was subject to intense scrutiny, and at times, outright hostility. The press was as likely to comment on her looks or her fashion sense as they were on her scientific achievements. It was as if they couldn't quite grasp the concept of a woman who could rock both a lab coat and a formal gown. And then there was the matter of her finances. Despite the accolades and the prestige, Marie wasn't exactly swimming in cash. The Nobel Prize money helped, but it wasn't a golden ticket. Research was expensive, and funding was always a concern. She managed her laboratory on a shoestring budget, stretching every franc like a scientific elastigirl. Yet somehow, she made it work, proving that necessity is indeed the mother of invention, and perhaps also the mother of scientific breakthroughs. Marie Curie's story is a testament to the power of perseverance in the face of adversity and the allure of myths that color our perception of history. She was a pioneer, yes, but also a human being with all the complexities and contradictions that entails. Her story is one of triumphs and trials, a tale that continues to illuminate the paths of those who follow in her footsteps, whether they are in search of scientific glory or just trying to make it through another day in the lab without glowing in the dark. Stay tuned, because Marie's tale isn't just about what she discovered, but how her life, like radium, continues to leave a lasting impact long after the initial spark has dimmed. And so, as Marie Curie's luminous legacy shone brighter than a radium-infused product on a store shelf, the world found itself embroiled in the chaos of World War I. It was 1914, and Europe was a powder keg that finally decided to blow, turning the continent into a stage for human misery. But let's not dwell on the grand historical backdrop just yet. Instead, picture this: a two-time Nobel laureate, a woman who had cracked the secrets of the atom, driving around in a van. Yes, it sounds like the plot twist in a quirky indie film, but it was very much reality. Marie Curie, the woman who put the rad in radium, found herself shifting gears from pure research to practical applications of her discoveries. As the war raged on, the need for medical advancements became as urgent as the morning coffee run. The battlefield was no place for the faint-hearted, and the sheer number of wounded soldiers required innovative solutions. Enter Marie, with a plan as ambitious as it was unorthodox: mobile X-ray units. Now, the idea of a mobile X-ray unit might seem like a no-brainer today, but back then, it was revolutionary. X-rays themselves were still relatively new, having been discovered by Wilhelm Röntgen in 1895, less than 2 decades before the war. But Marie saw their potential for saving lives amidst the carnage. She envisioned a fleet of vehicles equipped with X-ray machines, capable of traveling to the front lines to provide on-the-spot diagnostics. It was a logistical challenge tailor-made for someone who'd spent years navigating the scientific wilderness. With support from the French Red Cross and the Union of Women of France, Marie got to work. She wasn't just the brains behind the operation, she was also the brawn. Literally. She learned to drive, a feat as rare for women of her era as finding a unicorn in your backyard. She even took a crash course, not literally, thankfully, in auto mechanics, because when you're driving a van full of expensive and fragile equipment through mud and shellfire, knowing how to change a tire is a handy skill. Marie's mobile units, affectionately nicknamed Persian Curries, began rolling out by late 1914. Over the course of the war, she established over 200 such units, reaching more than 1 million soldiers. Talk about making an impact. The Persian Curries were essentially the Swiss Army knives of medical care, compact, versatile, and indispensable. They provided a way to locate bullets and shrapnel inside the wounded soldiers' bodies, which was as life-saving as it was groundbreaking. And here's where the economic context comes into play. While Marie's scientific endeavors were often strapped for cash, the war effort had a different financial calculus. The French military understood the value of keeping soldiers alive and kicking, and Marie's X-ray units were a cost-effective way to do just that. The total cost of setting up each unit was about 10,000 francs, peanuts compared to the price of prolonged medical treatment or the loss of manpower. But let's not sugarcoat the picture. Even with Marie's innovations, the war was a grim affair. The trenches were a hellscape, and the medical facilities were rudimentary at best. However, the presence of mobile X-ray units was a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak landscape. In a world where amputation was often the only answer, being able to accurately locate and remove foreign objects from the body was nothing short of miraculous. Of course, the idea of a woman leading such an endeavor wasn't entirely without its detractors. The societal changes that allowed Marie to step into this role were part of the broader upheavals of the time. With so many men at the front, women were stepping into roles traditionally reserved for their male counterparts. It was a shift in the social fabric, a small step toward gender equality that was both necessitated by war and resisted by those clinging to the old order. Marie Curie, with her X-ray units and mechanical skills, was more than just a wartime hero. She was a symbol of the changing times, a beacon of what women could achieve when given the chance, or when they simply seized it themselves. Her work during World War I wasn't just about saving lives. It was about proving that women could contribute to fields like science and technology just as much as men, if not more. And let's not forget the irony. Here was a woman who had once struggled to be taken seriously in academic circles, now driving a van across battlefields like the world's most overqualified delivery driver. Yet this was no ordinary delivery. It was a lifeline. A Nobel laureate in the trenches, Marie Curie was doing what she'd always done, breaking barriers and setting the kind of example that reverberates through history. Marie's impact during the war was immense, but her story doesn't end here. The societal shifts, the technological advancements, and her unyielding spirit were just the beginning of the changes she would continue to inspire. As the war drew to a close in 1918, the world was a different place, and so was the role of women within it. Marie Curie didn't just help win a war. She helped shape a future where women could drive both cars and change. Stay with us as we continue to explore the legacy of Marie Curie, a woman who turned the world of science on its head, one X-ray at a time. We'll dive deeper into how her work during the war laid the groundwork for future generations, and how she continued to blaze trails long after the echoes of battle had faded. This story is far from over, and there are more layers to uncover in the life of this extraordinary scientist and pioneer. As the echoes of battle faded and the dust settled on a war-torn Europe, Marie Curie found herself standing at the crossroads of history and innovation, her legacy casting a longer shadow than even the Eiffel Tower. The world was changing, and Marie, ever the pioneer, was right at the heart of it. Like a nucleus in the atom, she so famously unraveled. Her feats during World War, and with the mobile X-ray units, had proven that science could be as much a weapon of healing as it was of knowledge, a duality as paradoxical as radium itself. But let's not kid ourselves. Marie's journey hadn't been all Nobel glories and scientific revelations. Her story was a tapestry woven with threads of triumph and sacrifice, and behind the luminous glow of her scientific achievements lay a harsh reality. The radiation that danced with such allure in the lab was the very thing that dimmed the lives of those who exposed themselves to it, Marie included. By the time the 1920s rolled in, her health was deteriorating, a silent testament to the invisible hazards she had unknowingly embraced. The very elements she discovered were unraveling her at a molecular level, a dark irony not lost on history. Now, it's easy to romanticize her tale as one of lone genius, but Marie's legacy is as much about her personal sacrifices as it is about her scientific prowess. She was a mother, a widow, and a woman in a man's world, juggling roles like a circus performer with too few hands and too many balls. Add to that the ceaseless scrutiny from a society eager to pigeonhole her into a neat narrative, and you've got a reality as complex as the equations she loved to solve. Yet, through it all, Marie never faltered from her pursuit of knowledge, even if it meant sacrificing her own well-being. Fast forward to today, and Marie Curie's story continues to resonate, especially in the realm of women in STEM fields. Her life is a rallying cry for gender equality, a reminder that brilliance has no gender. In a world where women in science were as rare as unicorns at a horse race, Marie's achievements were a seismic shift. She was the original glass ceiling smasher, and her story has inspired countless women to break out their metaphorical hammers and get to work. But let's not get too caught up in the myth without acknowledging the reality. Even a century later, The gender gap in STEM fields is more of a chasm than a crack. Marie's tale is often romanticized, conveniently glossing over the struggle she faced. The truth is, her journey was a testament to grit and perseverance, a reminder that real change is often a marathon, not a sprint. Yet her legacy persists, like a beacon guiding future generations toward progress, equality, and discovery. Marie Curie didn't just leave behind a legacy of scientific brilliance. She left a blueprint for resilience. Her story is a testament to the power of curiosity, a trait as human as it is transformative. She taught us that true innovation comes from questioning the status quo, from daring to see the world not as it is, but as it could be. Her life was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a reminder that sometimes the greatest discoveries occur not in the lab, but in the willingness to pursue the unknown. And so, as we wrap up this journey through the life of Marie Curie, let's take a moment to reflect on her lasting impact. She was a woman who saw potential where others saw pitfalls, who turned obstacles into opportunities. Her story is a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge is a noble endeavor, one that requires sacrifice, resilience, and above all, an unyielding curiosity. Marie Curie was not just a scientist, but a pioneer, a trailblazer whose light continues to illuminate the path for those who dare to follow in her footsteps. Her legacy is a testament to the fact that while science may seek to understand the world, it's the people behind the discoveries who truly change it. Before TikTok and Twitter, the hardest trend around 2000 BCE was figuring out how to not starve. It wasn't just a survival thing. It was the cornerstone of what would eventually become the Mayan civilization. Picture a group of early Mesoamericans gathered around, not for a board meeting, but to figure out how to make their fields of corn the next big thing. Because, let's face it, back then, growing corn was basically launching a tech startup with a much lower risk of crashing. Now, the Mayans didn't just stumble upon agriculture, they innovated their way into it. They were the original hackers of the natural world, figuring out how to make maize a staple crop by 2000 BCE, which was no small feat. Think of maize like the iPhone of its day. It was revolutionary, versatile, and everyone wanted it. It wasn't just a food source. It was a status symbol, an economic powerhouse that laid the groundwork for everything that came after. The early Mayans were like those tech geniuses operating out of a garage, except their garage was a jungle, and their tech was terracing and irrigation. They transformed their environment with these agricultural innovations, creating sprawling village networks that would eventually morph into the massive city-states the Mayans are famous for. They didn't just plant seeds, they sowed the future of one of the most complex societies of the ancient world. Let's take a moment to appreciate the scale here. The Mayans didn't have tractors, fertilizers, or YouTube tutorials to guide them. They relied on good old-fashioned ingenuity and hardcore manual labor. They terraced the hillsides like they were trying to outperform Mother Nature at her own game. The result, a robust agricultural system that could support a growing population and fuel the rise of cities like Tikal and Kapan. It's like they unlocked the cheat codes for survival and prosperity. Speaking of survival, maize was more than just a cereal crop. It was the lifeblood of Mayan society. It shaped their calendar, their mythology, and even their identity. The Popol Vuh, the Mayan creation myth, tells us that humans were made from maize dough. Forget about being made of stardust. Mayans were all about that corn life. This myth wasn't just a story. It was a reflection of how deeply intertwined their existence was with their agricultural success. Now, let's debunk a myth that paints the Mayans as just mystical pyramid builders. Sure, the pyramids are fantastic, but they didn't spring up overnight. They were the result of an intricate society that had its roots in agriculture. The villagers who toiled in the fields weren't just farmers. They were laying the foundation for kingship, astronomy, and architecture. When you think about it, those early farmers were the unsung heroes, the real MVPs of Mayan civilization. And here's where it gets even more interesting, the political and social factors at play. The early Mayan villages were communal, but as they grew, so did the complexity of their societal structure. It's like going from a family-owned business to a multinational corporation. Suddenly, you need managers, supervisors, and a whole lot of organization. This was the seed of the hierarchical structure that would later define Mayan society. The early leaders, or shamans, were like the original influencers, guiding their communities with a mix of spiritual and practical wisdom. But let's not romanticize this too much. Life wasn't just a picturesque series of corn harvests and community gatherings. It was tough. Every day was a challenge against the elements, disease, and let's be honest, the occasional internal power struggle. Yet these hardships only made the Mayans more resourceful. They didn't just endure, they thrived, creating a legacy that would echo through history. So, while the modern tech world obsesses over the latest startup, remember that the Mayans were doing it millennia ago with corn. Their agricultural innovations were the catalyst for a civilization that would astound the world with its achievements. And it all started with the humble maize, the ancient world's answer to the app that changed everything. So, speaking of corn, our ancient world game changer, let's fast forward to when the Mayans took all that agricultural mojo and funneled it into building some of the most iconic cities this side of the Yucatan. Between 250 and 900 CE, the Mayans were in full swing, turning their city planning skills up to 11. Imagine a civilization flexing its muscle, not with skyscrapers or highways, but by erecting colossal stone pyramids that seem to dare gravity itself to do its worst. Now, before you start thinking that the Mayans had a secret stash of cranes and bulldozers hidden in the jungle, let's clear that up. They managed to build these architectural wonders without the help of the modern conveniences we take for granted. No metal tools, no wheels, no problem. It was all muscle, mathematics, and a hefty dose of ingenuity. Limestone was the building block of choice, and the Mayans became masters at quarrying and transporting it using nothing but human power. Imagine dragging huge stone blocks through dense forests. It's like a cross-fit session that lasts for months. Take Tikal, for example, a city that was the Mayan equivalent of Manhattan. By the height of its power, around 750 CE, Tikal was a bustling metropolis with a population that could have been as high as 100,000. Not bad for a city that started as a small village in the middle of a jungle. The central Acropolis was the heart of the city, a sprawling complex of temples and palaces that stood as a testament to the Mayans' architectural prowess. Towering above it all was Temple Roman IV, the largest pyramid at Tikal, which rises to a dizzying 230 feet. That's roughly a 20-story building, folks, all built stone by stone without a single power tool in sight. But these cities weren't just about flaunting architectural flair. They were the epicenters of Mayan political life, where kings played out a real-life version of Game of Thrones. Only here, the stakes were bloodier, the politics more cutthroat, and the fashion choices involved more vibrant feathers and jade jewelry than iron crowns. Each city-state was ruled by a king, or Agor, who was both a political leader and a divine figure. The Mayan kings claimed to be the intermediaries between their people and the gods, which is a pretty cushy gig if you can swing it. Being a Mayan king wasn't just about lounging in your palace sipping on cacao, though. The Agors had to constantly navigate alliances and rivalries with neighboring city-states, a task that required as much tact and strategy as it did brute force. Warfare was a common pastime, with cities like Tikal and Calakmul in a perpetual state of competition. These conflicts were a mix of ceremonial and strategic battles, where capturing a rival king could boost your street cred faster than you can say, human sacrifice. The politics of the Mayan world were as complex as their calendar system, which, by the way, is far more sophisticated than that 2012 apocalypse myth gave it credit for. The Mayans developed a full-fledged writing system, and their scribes recorded everything from royal lineages to astronomical observations, which were crucial for agricultural planning and religious ceremonies. This scribble class was vital to maintaining the bureaucracy necessary to run a city-state. Imagine them as the original data analysts, only with more hieroglyphs and fewer spreadsheets. It's easy to romanticize the Mayans as peaceful astronomers with a penchant for pyramids, but the reality was far more nuanced. The rise of any great civilization comes with its fair share of strife, and the Mayans were no exception. Internal power struggles were as common as the rainy season, and the political landscape was constantly shifting. Think of it as a high-stakes chess game, where each move had to be carefully calculated to avoid a checkmate that could mean the downfall of a dynasty. And let's not forget the economic gears turning behind this societal machine. The Mayan economy was a complex web of agriculture, trade, and tribute. Maize might have been the bread and butter, literally, but the Mayans also cultivated beans, squash, and cacao, the latter being so valuable it was used as currency. Meanwhile, obsidian, jade, and quetzal feathers were traded across vast networks, connecting city-states and facilitating cultural exchange. This economic dynamism was essential, fueling not just the construction of grand cities, but also the cultural and technological innovations that defined Mayan civilization. In the end, the Mayan story is one of grand achievements and equally grand challenges. They built cities that defied the jungle, developed a political system that was as intricate as a woven textile, and created a culture that continues to fascinate us today. But their world was also one of constant change and adaptation, a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of a people who thrived against the odds. And as the sun set on this golden age, the stage was set for new chapters in Mayan history. Chapters filled with even more intrigue, innovation, and yes, a bit of chaos too. Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning of the Mayan saga. As the curtain rises on this new act of the Mayan saga, get ready to swap those stone pyramids for something even more mind-boggling: numbers, stars, and scribbles. The Mayans, it seems, weren't just about building cities that poked the sky. They were busy creating an intellectual legacy that would make even the most ardent of mathletes swoon. Let's dive into the cultural zenith of the Mayans, where mathematics, astronomy, and writing came together in a symphony of genius that could make Einstein do a double-take. First up, mathematics. Now, before you roll your eyes at the thought of ancient calculus, let's clear up the basics. The Mayans developed a number system that was, frankly, ahead of its time. They used a base 20 system, or vigesimal if you want to impress your friends at trivia night. This wasn't just about counting corn cobs or warriors. These guys were calculating with a level of sophistication that let them build those aforementioned gravity-defying pyramids with precision. Their number system came complete with the concept of zero, something the Romans couldn't even wrap their togas around. The Mayans were using zero around 36 BCE, which puts them centuries ahead of Europe. Take that, Pythagoras. But it wasn't just about numbers for numbers' sake. This mathematical prowess had a practical edge. Mayan architects used it to align their structures with astronomical events, ensuring that their buildings weren't just eye-catching, but also cosmically relevant. Talk about real estate with a view. It's like the Zillow of the ancient world, where the listings come with a side of celestial significance. Speaking of celestial bodies, let's chat about the Mayan calendar, the ultimate cosmic cheat sheet. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill, hang-it-on-the-fridge kind of calendar. Oh no, it was a complex system of interlocking cycles that would make even the most advanced weather apps seem about as reliable as a horoscope. The Mayans tracked solar and lunar cycles with such accuracy that their calendar was off by only a few seconds per year. And while 2012 didn't bring the apocalypse, one can't help but admire the precision that got us all in a tizzy. The calendar was more than just a way to keep track of time. It was a tool that connected the mundane with the divine. It dictated religious ceremonies, agricultural cycles, and even political events. Imagine planning your next big event not just around your schedule, but around the cosmos itself. Talk about going above and beyond. And now, let's take a stroll through the heavens, because Mayan astronomers were more than just stargazers with a penchant for pretty lights. They observed the movements of Venus like it was the hardest reality show in the sky. Venus was crucial in determining the timing of wars, coronations, and other significant events. If you think your morning horoscope is influential, it's got nothing on these celestial prognostications. The Mayans recorded these astronomical observations in codices, the ancient world's version of a Kindle, filled with hieroglyphs rather than e-books. Sadly, most of these codices didn't survive the enthusiastic but destructive tendencies of Spanish conquistadors. Only a handful remain, like the Dresden Codex, which continues to serve as a Rosetta Stone into Mayan astronomy and rituals. And speaking of writing, the Mayans were putting pen to paper, or rather, stylus to bark paper, long before it was cool. Their written language was a complex system of hieroglyphs, with over 800 distinct signs that could be combined to form words and sentences. The Mayan scribes were akin to literary rock stars, recording everything from royal decrees to epic tales of gods and heroes. This written tradition was vital in maintaining the continuity of Mayan culture, as it allowed them to pass down knowledge through generations. Now, let's tackle the sweet bean that changed the world, chocolate. While the Aztecs often get the credit for the divine drink, the Mayans were the original cacao connoisseurs. They cherished cacao not just as a delightful beverage, but as a currency and a gift to the gods. Forget about the Nobel Prize. The Mayans were already sipping their way to happiness with chocolate long before Europeans even knew what they were missing. Imagine a society where chocolate is both a treat and a trade currency. It's like Willy Wonka meets Wall Street, but let's not sugarcoat it too much. The process of cultivating and trading cacao was labor-intensive and closely tied to the Mayan economy. It required skilled laborers and extensive trade networks, demonstrating how their advanced societal structures supported even their sweetest indulgences. So, as we marvel at the Mayan achievements in mathematics, astronomy, and writing, let's remember that these were more than just intellectual exercises. They were the threads that wove together the very fabric of Mayan society, connecting the earthly with the celestial and the practical with the sacred. These accomplishments were born not just from genius, but from necessity, from a world where understanding the stars could mean the difference between prosperity and disaster. As our historical journey continues, keep in mind that the Mayans were not just architects of stone, but builders of knowledge, whose legacy challenges us to see the world in numbers, stars, and stories. So buckle up, because the Mayan saga has much more in store, and it's only getting more fascinating from here. As we continue our historical trek through the Mayan jungle of numbers, stars, and stories, let's pivot to a plot twist that would make any Netflix series producer salivate: the decline of the Mayan civilization by 900 CE. You see, one moment you're riding high on the cosmic calendar, and the next you're ghosting your own golden age. It's like watching a rock band implode at the peak of their fame, only with fewer guitars and more pyramids. So what exactly happened? Buckle up, history buffs, because we're diving headfirst into a cauldron of climate change, political strife, and a serious lack of ancient spa days. First, let's talk climate change, not the modern kind with debates about carbon footprints, but rather a harsh reality check from Mother Nature herself. Around the 9th century, the Yucatan Peninsula got a not-so-friendly memo from the Climate Department. Severe droughts that could make a cactus sweat. We're talking about a series of prolonged dry spells that hit around 820 CE and continued to torment the region with the relentlessness of a bad Wi-Fi connection. Without water, those lush cornfields, the backbone of Mayan economy and sustenance, turned into fields of dust. And you thought your lawn was bad. Imagine how this impacted the Mayans. Water was more than just a thirst quencher. It was central to their agriculture, religious ceremonies, and daily life. When the heavens closed their taps, the ripple effect was catastrophic. Crops failed, food became scarce, and social tensions simmered like a pot left too long on the flame. It's a grim reminder that even the mightiest civilizations are at the mercy of nature's whims. But wait, there's more. The droughts weren't the only puzzle piece in this ancient mystery. Enter stage left, political strife. The Mayan civilization wasn't a monolithic empire, but a collection of fiercely independent city-states, each with their own ambitions and agendas. Picture a medieval Europe of the jungle, with each city-state acting like a mini-kingdom. When resources dwindled, these political entities didn't exactly hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Instead, they engaged in what historians like to call elite competition, which is a polite way to describe power grabs, warfare, and the occasional royal backstabbing. Take the rivalry between Tikal and Calakmul, for example. These two powerhouses were like the Coke and Pepsi of the Mayan world, constantly trying to outdo each other. But when the going got tough, the tough got going, to war. These conflicts drained resources, destabilized the political landscape, and left cities vulnerable to both internal dissent and external threats. It's like Game of Thrones, but with more jaguar pelts and fewer dragons. And let's not forget the social fabric that began to fray. The Mayan society was hierarchical, with the adjure and nobility enjoying the high life, while the commoners did the heavy lifting. As resources became scarcer and the elite continued their lavish lifestyles, social unrest brewed like a storm on the horizon. Imagine being a farmer who's already struggling to feed your family, and then watching the local king throw a lavish festival. It's enough to make anyone rethink their allegiance. Now, here's a plot twist. Some of the decline may have been self-inflicted. The Mayans were experts at urban planning, but perhaps they overestimated their ecological footprint. Deforestation for agriculture and city building could have exacerbated the environmental crises. It's like ancient urban sprawl with a side of ecological overshoot. When you chop down your forests faster than you can say sustainable development, you're setting yourself up for a fall. And as we explore these theories, let's not forget the cultural and spiritual dimensions. The Mayan cosmology was deeply tied to their understanding of the world. When natural disasters struck, it wasn't just a physical crisis. It was a spiritual one. Kings who were seen as divine intermediaries were suddenly failing to appease the gods. Cue the loss of faith in leadership, which only added fuel to the already raging fire of discontent. It's a bit like blaming your CEO for a software crash, but with more sacrificial rituals. Some suggest that as city-states faltered, populations might have migrated to more habitable regions or smaller communities, leading to the decentralization of power. It's akin to leaving the big city hustle for a quiet life in the countryside, hoping to escape the chaos. This migration could have fragmented the once unified cultural identity, leading to a more dispersed and less cohesive society. But before we start penning an obituary for the Mayans, let's acknowledge their resilience. Despite these challenges, not all city-states collapsed simultaneously, and some regions even thrived during periods of decline. This wasn't an overnight downfall, but a gradual transformation, with some areas adapting and evolving while others faced ruin. It's a testament to the complexity and adaptability of human societies. As we mull over these theories, it's clear that the Mayan decline was not a simple case of one and done. Instead, it was a perfect storm of environmental, political, and social factors, each adding its own flavor to the melting pot of history. And while the Mayans may not have had a spa day to rejuvenate their civilization, their legacy continues to intrigue and puzzle us. So, as we leave this chapter open for further exploration, remember that the Mayans were more than just builders of pyramids. They were architects of a vibrant, albeit tumultuous, world. Their story isn't over yet, so stay tuned for the next installment, where we'll delve deeper into the mysteries and marvels of this fascinating civilization. As we leave the dramatic saga of Mayan decline hanging like a cliffhanger from your favorite binge-worthy series, let's pivot to the final act, the legacy of a civilization that has left a more lasting impression than a footprint on the sandy shores of the Yucatan. Fast forward to today, where the Mayans are often painted in broad strokes, courtesy of Hollywood's obsession with doomsday calendars and mystical pyramids. But their real story deserves more than a blockbuster spectacle. It's a tale that's deeper, richer, and infinitely more compelling. Let's start with a quick myth-busting session. Remember that 2012 apocalypse hysteria? You know, when everyone was panic buying canned beans and bottled water because some folks thought the world was about to end. Yeah, that was based on a misinterpretation of the Mayan calendar. The Mayans weren't predicting an end. They were just flipping the page to a new cycle. It's like freaking out when your wall calendar runs out of days in December. Spoiler alert, the world didn't end, and the Mayans had a more nuanced view of time than a mere countdown to Armageddon. Now, onto the real legacy. The Mayans were pioneers in fields that continue to resonate in our modern world. Take their advancements in mathematics. Remember that clever-based 20 system with zero. Fast forward a few centuries, and you'll find that this mathematical brilliance laid the groundwork for advancements in architecture, astronomy, and beyond. Their ability to calculate and construct with precision has left us not just with stunning ruins, but with a legacy of intellectual vigor. And speaking of stars, let's not forget the Mayan astronomers who could outchart a modern astrologer any day. Their astronomical observations were so precise that they could predict solar eclipses and track planetary movements with jaw-dropping accuracy. This wasn't just stargazing for fun. It was crucial for agricultural planning and religious ceremonies. Today, their knowledge continues to inspire astronomers and historians alike, proving that looking up can sometimes provide the best insights. But here's where it gets even more fascinating: the influence of Mayan culture on contemporary society. Those ancient scribes, with their hieroglyphic prowess, recorded stories and histories that have survived the test of time. Their narratives have been passed down through generations, influencing modern literature, cinema, and even pop culture. Ever read a fantasy novel that includes elements of ancient mythology? Chances are it's got a sprinkle of Mayan influence somewhere in its DNA. And let's not overlook the societal structures the Mayans put in place. Their city-states, with their complex political systems, offer a window into governance and social organization. While modern democracies don't exactly mimic Mayan politics, thankfully without the human sacrifices, there's much to learn from their ability to create and maintain large-scale urban centers. The challenges they faced, from resource management to social stratification, continue to resonate in today's globalized world. Now, here's a sharp observation for you. The Mayans were masters of adaptation. Climate change, political upheavals, social unrest. They faced it all and still managed to leave a legacy that endures. While some city-states crumbled, others adapted and evolved, proving that resilience is a key driver in the survival of cultures. It's a lesson that echoes through history and into our own turbulent times. But let's not romanticize everything. The Mayans, like all great civilizations, had their flaws, and their decline was as much a result of human error as it was cosmic fate. Yet this does not detract from their achievements. Instead, it humanizes them, making their story one of triumphs and tragedies, innovations and oversights. It's a narrative as rich and complex as the society they built, and it deserves to be told with all its nuances intact. In today's media landscape, the Mayans are often reduced to caricatures of mystical pyramid builders or doomsday prophets, but their real legacy is far more profound. It's a legacy of knowledge, innovation, and cultural richness that continues to inspire and educate. From the cornfields of antiquity to the stars above, the Mayans have left an indelible mark on the tapestry of human history. So, as we wrap up this historical journey, let's remember the Mayans not as harbingers of doom, but as pioneers of a civilization that dared to dream big, reach for the stars, and build a legacy that defies the passage of time. In a world obsessed with the next big thing, perhaps the greatest lesson the Mayans teach us is that true greatness isn't just about innovation. It's about leaving a lasting impact that transcends centuries. And that, dear friends, is a legacy worth celebrating. In the coastal town of Porbandar, where the air felt thick with salt and tradition, a young Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was about as intimidating as a kitten wearing glasses. Born on October 2, 1869, this future giant of a man was initially a bit of a mouse. Picture a guy who, as a student, was too shy to even squeak out a coherent sentence in front of his classmates. His early school reports might as well have read, "Nice kid, could use some volume control upwards." Yet, Gandhi had something of a rebellious streak, not the loud, smash-the-system kind, but more of a quiet, internal rebellion. He was the youngest of three brothers, which probably explains his penchant for quietly questioning authority. His father, Karamchand Gandhi, was a Dewan, think Prime Minister, but more local and less scandal-ridden in Porbandar. Meanwhile, his mother, Putlibai, was a devout practitioner of Vaishnavism, which meant little Mohandas grew up around a lot of fasting and praying. One might suspect this is where he got his affinity for hunger strikes, but that's a story for another day. Fast forward a few years, and Gandhi found himself married at the ripe old age of 13. Yes, you heard that right. 13. It was an arranged marriage, of course, to a girl named Kasturba, who was all of 14. In what must have been the most awkward teenage alliance ever, they had to navigate the complexities of married life while still basically being kids. Talk about a crash course in adulting. After some years of this intricate dance of adolescence and marriage, Gandhi decided to try his luck overseas. The destination? London, a place as foreign to him as tofu is to a steakhouse. His family scraped together the funds, around £100, which was no small sum back then, and shipped him off to study law in 1888. Gandhi, the future icon of simplicity, was about to enter the world of top hats and ballroom dancing. Now, Gandhi in London is something worth picturing. Imagine a young Indian man in the late 19th century trying to fit into the buttoned-up British society. This was a time when the British Empire was at its peak, and London was the centre of it all. Gandhi, in his earnest attempt to assimilate, decided that wearing a top hat and taking dancing lessons was the way to go. Yes, Gandhi, the man who would later be immortalized in a loincloth, once spent good money on dancing lessons. But here's the kicker. He was terrible at it. Primary sources tell us that he found the steps confusing and the rhythm elusive, which is pretty much the universal experience of anyone who's ever tried to learn the foxtrot. His attempts at becoming a proper English gentleman didn't stop there. He even tried elocution lessons to master the Queen's English and improve his shy demeanor. Spoiler alert, the lessons didn't take, but the effort was commendable. Gandhi's time in London wasn't all awkward social experiments. He also devoured books, including the Bhagavad Gita, which he described as his spiritual dictionary. It was here that the seeds of his philosophical beliefs were sown. He began to question not just his own identity, but the identity of India under British rule. He was slowly, almost imperceptibly, transforming from a self-conscious young man into someone who would eventually challenge empires. But at this point, he was still more about learning the law than laying it down. Despite these humorous attempts at Britishness, Gandhi's heart was never really in it. The hat, the dance, the elocution, it was all a bit much, even for him. He later reflected on these efforts with a wry smile, acknowledging the absurdity of his younger self. In his autobiography, he wrote, "I wasted 10 minutes on my attire every day. I was a fit of laughter for my friends." It was a small rebellion against his own insecurities, a reminder that even the most serious figures can have a laugh at their own expense. As the calendar flipped to 1891, Gandhi was called to the bar, not the kind with drinks and questionable choices, but the legal kind. He was now a qualified barrister, ready to take on the world, or at least the courtroom. But destiny had other plans, and the courtroom drama would have to wait. For now, he was heading back to India, a place that had changed as much as he had during his time away. Back in India, Gandhi's career as a lawyer didn't exactly set the world on fire. In fact, it was more like a damp match in a monsoon. His first case in Bombay was a disaster. He stood there, tongue-tied and nervous, unable to utter a word in front of the judge. It was a humbling moment, a reminder that confidence couldn't be bought with a top hat or learned in a dance studio. But this failure was a stepping stone, not a stumbling block. Gandhi's journey from a shy, awkward student to a self-assured lawyer was full of missteps and minor humiliations. However, each misstep was a step forward. It's almost poetic how this man, who couldn't find his footing in a dance class, would later lead a nation in a graceful, non-violent waltz towards independence. Thus, this was Gandhi in his formative years, an unlikely hero in the making, full of contradictions and surprising quirks. He was a man who tried to be someone he wasn't, only to find out that who he really was could change the course of history. The top hat was left behind, but the lessons learned in London would stick with him, shaping the visionary leader he was destined to become. As Gandhi left India for South Africa in 1893, he was more anxious than a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. This move, ostensibly for a 1-year contract with an Indian firm in Natal, turned into a 21-year-long saga that would transform him from a hesitant lawyer into a global symbol of resistance. It was here that Gandhi's journey took a decisive turn, not just figuratively, but literally, when he boarded a train in Pyramaritzburg. Ah, the infamous train incident. In case you've been hiding under a rock or just skipped history class, it goes like this. Gandhi was thrown off a train because he dared to sit in a first-class compartment reserved for whites. The year was 1893, and the racial laws of South Africa were about as polite as a slap in the face. Gandhi had a first-class ticket, mind you, but that didn't matter. In the eyes of the conductor, his skin color was a one-way ticket to the platform. As Gandhi spent that cold night shivering in the Pyramaritzburg station, something shifted within him. This wasn't just a personal indignity. It was the spark that ignited a lifelong battle against the deep-seated injustices of colonial rule. Now, it's tempting to romanticize this as the moment when Gandhi became the Gandhiji we know today. But let's not skip over the nitty-gritty. The reality was less like a Hollywood transformation montage and more like an awkward coming-of-age film. Gandhi didn't just wake up the next morning ready to take on the British Empire with a smile and a dhoti. It was a gradual process, full of doubts and small victories, akin to learning to ride a bike in heavy traffic. The South Africa that Gandhi landed in wasn't just a sunny stretch of land at the bottom of Africa. It was a melting pot of cultures, all under the oppressive thumb of British colonial rule. The Indian community, numbering around 150,000 by the turn of the century, was a mix of indentured laborers and merchants, both groups fighting for their right to exist with dignity. Gandhi's legal practice quickly became a platform for activism. He started by helping the Indian merchants of Durban fight against a bill that aimed to disenfranchise them. This wasn't just about legal wrangling, but about asserting that they were more than just the sum of their rupees. His strategy was as simple as it was radical: non-violent resistance, or as he called it, satyagraha. Now, here's a term that deserves more than a cursory glance. Satyagraha, meaning truth force or soul force, was Gandhi's brainchild, a novel approach to political struggle that eschewed violence in favor of steadfast, peaceful opposition. It was like bringing a bouquet of flowers to a bar fight. Gandhi's belief in the power of truth and moral integrity was as unshakable as a sumo wrestler on a tightrope. And in a world where might often made right, this was revolutionary. But let's not kid ourselves. Non-violence was not for the faint-hearted. It demanded deep courage and discipline, qualities Gandhi was still honing. By 1906, in response to the Transvaal government's imposition of a law requiring all Indians to register and carry passes at all times, Gandhi organized his first major campaign of civil disobedience. The Indian community was united in their refusal to comply, and many, including Gandhi, were arrested. Imagine the scene: a crowd of Indians, standing resolute in the face of harsh British law, refusing to budge despite the looming threat of imprisonment. It was like watching a David vs. Goliath story unfold in real time. And here's where things get interesting. The myth often suggests that Gandhi was some sort of celestial being who floated above human flaws. But let's ground this tale a bit. Gandhi was endlessly experimenting with his own life, and South Africa was his laboratory. He faced criticism and setbacks, not least from those who felt his methods were too passive. Yet he remained undeterred, perhaps because he understood that the greatest revolutions often began with the smallest acts of defiance. There were practical realities to contend with too. Take the economic angle. Gandhi understood that money talked, and not just in the metaphorical sense. The Indian merchants he represented were crucial to the economy, and their plight highlighted the absurdity of racial discrimination harming economic prosperity. Gandhi's knack for connecting the dots between economic interests and moral imperatives was a masterstroke. He used it to rally support and drive home the point that oppressing one community weakened the whole societal fabric. But let's pause a moment to debunk the notion that Gandhi was universally adored in South Africa. The truth is, he was a polarizing figure. Some saw him as a troublemaker, a thorn in the side of the colonial establishment. Others, particularly within the Indian community, viewed him as a beacon of hope in a landscape of despair. Even among his supporters, there were those who questioned his methods. Activism, like a good curry, was not to everyone's taste. Gandhi's years in South Africa were marked by personal challenges too. He grappled with his own identity, a complex blend of Indian traditions and British influences. He adopted a simple lifestyle, shedding his Western attire for the Indian dhoti that would become his trademark. This wasn't just a style choice. It was a statement of solidarity with the masses he sought to represent. The transition from lawyer to activist was as much about shedding old skins as it was about donning new ones. As Gandhi's reputation grew, so did the mythos surrounding him. He was becoming a symbol, not just of the Indian struggle, but of a universal quest for justice. Yet, let's not forget the sheer grit it took to maintain that symbol. Gandhi was constantly refining his ideas, learning from each setback, and adjusting his tactics. This wasn't a man resting on his laurels. It was a man who understood that the road to change was long and winding, with no guarantees of success. By the time Gandhi left South Africa in 1914, he had laid the groundwork for what would become a global movement. He had also learned a crucial lesson, that real change required not just righteous anger, but strategic patience. His experiences in South Africa would serve as a blueprint for his later campaigns in India, where he would continue to challenge the mighty British Empire with nothing more than truth and a stubborn refusal to back down. So, as we leave South Africa and prepare to follow Gandhi back to his homeland, let's hold on to this image. A man who, despite being thrown off a train, managed to stay on track. His journey was far from over, and the stakes were about to get a lot higher. But that's a story for another day, one filled with salt marches, spinning wheels, and a nation on the brink of change. Stay tuned, because this ride is just getting started. As Gandhi set foot back in India in 1915, the air was thick with anticipation, much like the charged atmosphere before a thunderstorm. He was greeted not as the young barrister who had left years ago, but as a seasoned activist with stories of triumph over racial injustice tucked under his belt, or Dodi, as it were. India was a different beast altogether, wrestling with its own demons under the British Raj, and Gandhi was about to become its unlikely hero. Let's be real. Gandhi's homecoming wasn't exactly the red carpet affair one might expect. Instead of a triumphant horn section, he was met with a cacophony of political chaos and social unrest. The British were still the unwelcome guests who'd overstayed their welcome, and the Indian populace was growing more restless than a cat in a room full of laser pointers. By 1920, Gandhi had already planted the seeds of what would become the non-cooperation movement. Now, if you're thinking this was some kind of grand gesture involving fireworks and impassioned speeches, think again. Gandhi's strategy was rooted in simplicity, an elegant, almost maddening simplicity. Imagine telling an entire nation to just stop cooperating with their oppressors. Don't buy British goods, don't send your kids to British schools, and certainly don't offer your legal skills to their courts. It was like a national timeout, but with real stakes. The genius of this plan lay not just in its simplicity, but in its economic punch. The British Raj was like a monstrous machine fueled by the Indian economy. By withdrawing cooperation, Gandhi aimed to starve the beast. And boy, did it have an impact. Indian imports from Britain dropped from pound 102 million in 1920 to pound 57 million by 1922. That's a financial hit that even the most seasoned Wall Street traders would wince at. But, and there's always a but, the non-cooperation movement wasn't without its hiccups. Gandhi's vision required a level of discipline and unity that was, frankly, hard to muster. It was one thing to inspire people, another to keep them from veering off the path. The movement had its share of missteps, like the infamous Chori Chora incident in 1922, where a mob went rogue and torched a police station, killing 22 policemen. Gandhi, ever the stickler for non-violence, was devastated. He called off the movement, proving that even the most steadfast leaders sometimes have to slam the brakes. Then came 1930, the year of the Salt March. Now, if you think the phrase game changer is overused, well, this is the historical event that earned it. Picture Gandhi, not as the stoic figure we often see in photographs, but as a determined man leading a 240-mile trek from Sabarmati Ashram to the coastal village of Dandi. It sounds epic, right? And it was, but in a way that was refreshingly human. Gandhi, at 61 years old, armed with nothing but a walking stick and an indomitable spirit, embarked on this journey with 78 of his followers. By the time they reached Dandi, 24 days later, they were joined by thousands more. This wasn't just a long walk for some fresh sea air. It was a calculated move against the salt tax imposed by the British, a levy so absurd it would be laughable if it weren't so oppressive. The British had essentially claimed a monopoly over salt production in India, taxing even the poorest citizens' staple. Gandhi's simple act of picking up a lump of salt was a thunderous declaration of defiance. It was as if he was saying, "Here's your precious salt, now what are you going to do about it?" And what did the British do? They arrested over 60,000 people, including Gandhi himself. Talk about overreacting. But the Salt March had already done its damage. It was a PR nightmare for the British, showing the world that their grip on India wasn't as ironclad as they'd like to think. The image of a frail man challenging an empire was irresistible, a David and Goliath story that captured global attention. Gandhi's brilliance lay in turning everyday items into symbols of resistance. Salt, spinning wheels, even the simple act of wearing homespun cloth. These became the weapons of choice in a battle where the mind was as sharp as any sword. But let's not get too misty-eyed about it. The reality was harsh. Many Indians suffered brutal crackdowns. The British were not exactly known for their gentle touch, and their response was as heavy-handed as a sumo wrestler in a tea shop. The Salt March exposed the British Raj's vulnerabilities like few other events had. It highlighted the economic absurdities and moral bankruptcy of colonial rule. Yet, it also showcased the challenges of sustaining a non-violent movement. Gandhi's approach required patience and sacrifice, qualities that are in short supply when people are desperate for change. However, here's the rub. While the Salt March was a symbolic victory, it didn't immediately translate into political change. The British didn't pack up and leave the next day. The struggle for independence was far from over, and Gandhi knew this. But what the march did achieve was a shift in the global narrative. It forced the world to see India not as a British possession, but as a nation demanding its rightful place on the world stage. As we draw this chapter to a close, let's remember that Gandhi's journey was never just about India. It was about challenging the very notion of power and control, flipping the script on what it meant to be powerful. And in this, Gandhi was a maestro. He understood that true power lay not in domination, but in the ability to inspire and unite people under a common cause. So, while the British might have thought they'd quashed yet another rebellion, they underestimated the tenacity of a man who could transform humble salt into a weapon of mass awakening. Gandhi's path was fraught with obstacles and occasional missteps, a reminder that even legends operate in the messy realm of reality. But he was far from done, and the story of India's fight for independence was still unfolding. Stay tuned, because the next chapter promises more twists, turns, and a nation on the brink of a new dawn. As the echoes of the Salt March faded, Gandhi found himself once again at the center of a storm, this time in the shadow of World War Roman II. The 1940, a decade where the world seemed to have collectively lost its marbles. While Europe was embroiled in a colossal game of risk gone horribly wrong, India was gearing up for a different kind of battle. Enter the Quit India movement, a movement as controversial as ordering pineapple on pizza. The scene was set in August 1942, when the All India Congress Committee met in Bombay, now Mumbai, and passed the Quit India resolution. With the rallying cry of do or die, Gandhi essentially told the British Empire to pack its bags and leave. This wasn't just a polite request. It was akin to giving the empire a one-way ticket to irrelevance. The British, predictably, were less than thrilled. They responded by arresting Gandhi and other leaders faster than you can say colonial overreaction. Let's take a moment to unpack the economic and political baggage here. The war effort had left Britain more cash-strapped than a college student at a car dealership. India was a crucial supplier, not just of raw materials, but also soldiers, a whopping 2. 5 million Indian troops were fighting for the Allies. The British needed India, like a fish needs water, to keep their war machine chugging along. But Gandhi saw through this facade. For him, the war was a grim reminder of why India needed to break free. He argued that fighting for democracy abroad while being denied it at home was as hypocritical as a cat preaching veganism. Now, here's where the myth and reality tango. The romanticized version paints Gandhi as the infallible leader, but let's not forget the complexity of human nature. The Quit India movement, despite its noble intentions, was not universally embraced. Within India itself, there were divisions. Some felt that Gandhi's timing was about as good as a rainstorm during a picnic. They argued that supporting the British in the war was a necessary evil to fend off the Axis powers. Others feared the chaos that might follow an abrupt British exit, envisioning a power vacuum that could plunge the nation into anarchy. Gandhi's negotiations with the British during this era were nothing short of a chess match, with each side trying to outmaneuver the other. Consider the infamous Churchill-Gandhi dynamic. Winston Churchill, the man who once said he had not become the king's first minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire, had as much disdain for Gandhi as a cat has for a cucumber. Churchill saw Gandhi not as a saintly figure, but as a half-naked fakir, a snide jab that revealed a lot about the British mindset of the time. But Gandhi, ever the pragmatist, knew how to play the game. His image as the saintly spinner was both genuine and a masterclass in strategic branding. The spinning wheel, or charkha, was more than a symbol of self-reliance. It was a direct challenge to British economic interests. By promoting the use of homespun cloth, or khadi, Gandhi was hitting the British textile industry where it hurt, in the profit margins. This wasn't just a fashion statement, it was economic warfare, Gandhi style. The irony, of course, is that while Gandhi was spinning yarn, the British were busy spinning diplomatic webs. They promised post-war independence as a carrot, hoping to keep India invested in the Allied cause. Yet these promises were about as trustworthy as a chocolate teapot. Gandhi, with his knack for seeing through political smoke and mirrors, wasn't buying it. For him, the time for half measures was over. The Quit India movement was his bold declaration that India's destiny was its own to shape, not a pawn in the geopolitical chessboard of World War Roman II. However, the reality was grim. The British crackdown was brutal, with over 100,000 arrests and widespread censorship. The movement, while galvanizing, was also fragmented. It didn't help that the Congress leadership was mostly behind bars, rendering the movement leaderless and prone to sporadic violence. This wasn't the peaceful protest of yore, but a raw, unfiltered cry for freedom that often spiraled into chaos. Yet, amid the tumult, Gandhi's ability to capture the world's imagination remained intact. The sight of a frail man, imprisoned yet unbowed, continued to inspire. His strategy of non-violence, though challenged, was a powerful reminder of the strength of moral courage over brute force. The British were learning, albeit slowly, that they were up against an opponent who fought not with weapons, but with ideas, a battle infinitely harder to win. Gandhi's journey through this period was a testament to his resilience and his understanding of the power dynamics at play. He knew that the British Empire, stretched thin by the war, was vulnerable. His aim was to exploit this vulnerability, to push the British into a corner where granting India its freedom was the only viable option. But this was a high-stakes gamble, and Gandhi was playing with the future of a nation. As the war dragged on, the world began to change in ways that few could have predicted. The colonial tide was turning, as countries across Asia and Africa began to clamor for independence. The British, once the masters of a global empire where the sun never set, were realizing that their grip was slipping. Gandhi, with his relentless pursuit of justice, was a key figure in this seismic shift. He understood that the struggle for independence was part of a larger narrative, one that transcended borders and challenged the very notion of empire. So, as we close this chapter on Gandhi's wartime endeavors, let's remember the man behind the myth, a leader who dared to dream of a free India, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. His journey was fraught with challenges, but it was also a story of hope, resilience, and the unwavering belief that truth and justice would ultimately prevail. The Quit India movement was not the end, but a pivotal moment in India's quest for freedom, a quest that was far from over. Stay tuned, because the final act is yet to unfold, and it promises to be a gripping tale of triumph against all odds. As the war-weary world inched towards the end of World War Roman II, India found itself standing at the precipice of a new era. The British Empire, now resembling a tired boxer in the 12th round, knew it was time to cut its losses. By 1947, the Union Jack was finally lowered, and India stepped into the sunlight of independence. But before you cue the triumphant music, let's pause for a reality check. Independence came with a hefty price tag, and Gandhi's vision for a united India was shattered by the partition. The subcontinent was cleaved into two, creating India and Pakistan, a decision as divisive as pineapple on pizza and with far more tragic consequences. The partition unleashed a torrent of violence across the newly drawn borders. An estimated 15 million people were displaced, and up to 2 million lost their lives in communal riots. Gandhi, the apostle of peace, was heartbroken. Here was a man who spent decades advocating non-violence, only to witness his beloved nation tear itself apart. It was a stark reminder that even the most visionary leaders can't control every outcome. Jinnah, Nehru, Mountbatten, they all played their parts in this complex drama, but the end result was a messy reality that no single leader could have neatly packaged. Now, about that Gandhi myth. The narrative often paints him as an infallible saint, a view about as one-dimensional as a pancake, but the real Gandhi was a mosaic of contradictions. Take his views on technology and industrialization, for instance. While the world was gearing up for the industrial age, Gandhi was advocating for a return to simple living, spinning wheels and all. He saw industrialization as a threat to the rural economy, fearing it would lead to dehumanization and exploitation. In a world obsessed with progress, Gandhi's anti-industrial stance seemed as quaint as a typewriter in the age of emails. But was he entirely wrong? Gandhi's focus on self-reliance and sustainability resonates more today than ever. In an era of climate change, and runaway capitalism, his warnings about the perils of industrial excess and the importance of local economies sound eerily prescient. Yet, it's crucial to acknowledge the limitations of his vision. In a country as vast and diverse as India, expecting the masses to eschew modernity for a pastoral lifestyle was a bit like asking a cheetah to take up knitting. Gandhi's legacy, however, stretches far beyond India's borders. His philosophy of non-violence and civil disobedience inspired a global audience. Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and Aung San Suu Kyi are just a few of the leaders who drew from Gandhi's playbook. King, who faced the racial injustices of 1960s America, famously said that Gandhi's approach was the only morally and practically sound method open to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom. There's a poetic irony in how a man who was once thrown off a train in South Africa would later help shape the civil rights movement in the United States. But let's not gloss over the imperfections. Gandhi's personal life was as complex as his political one. He was known for his eccentric lifestyle choices and controversial views on sexuality and celibacy, which raised more eyebrows than an ill-timed dad joke. His experiments with truth were not just about political tactics, but also about self-discipline and moral conduct. Some of his practices, like testing his vow of celibacy by sleeping next to young women, were eyebrow-raising, to say the least, and have been criticized as deeply problematic. Yet, here's the kicker. Gandhi never claimed to be perfect. In his autobiography, fittingly titled The Story of My Experiments with Truth, he laid bare his flaws and contradictions. He was, in many ways, a man ahead of his time yet deeply rooted in tradition, a walking paradox who wielded humility as deftly as he did influence. As we wrap up this journey through Gandhi's life, let's reflect on the duality of his legacy. On one hand, he was a spiritual and political leader whose teachings continue to inspire generations. On the other, he was a human being, subject to the same doubts and errors as the rest of us. His story is a testament to the power of ideas over brute force, the belief that change is possible without a gun in hand. Gandhi's enduring influence is like a stone thrown into a pond, the ripples extending far beyond the point of impact. His life invites us to question the nature of power, the possibility of peace, and the meaning of progress. It's a story that challenges us to look beyond the myth and embrace the messy, imperfect humanity within. Because, in the end, Gandhi's greatest achievement wasn't in leading a nation to freedom, but in showing us that even the smallest act of defiance can spark a revolution. So, as you drift off to sleep, ponder this. In a world of complexities and contradictions, perhaps the truest legacy of Gandhi is the reminder that change begins with a single, determined step. And sometimes, that step is as simple as picking up a pinch of salt. When Cyrus the Great first entered the historical stage, around 559 BCE, he wasn't exactly a household name. In fact, he was more like the underdog in a rags-to-riches story that would make any motivational speaker swoon. Starting out as the leader of the modest Persian tribe in the southwest of present-day Iran, Cyrus had ambitions bigger than his immediate surroundings. And by bigger, I mean transforming a relatively insignificant group into the sprawling Persian Empire, an empire that would eventually stretch its muscles across 3 continents. Let's talk about his first big move, the unification of the Medes. Now, the Medes were no pushovers. They were a formidable people, ruling a significant chunk of land, and not exactly in the market for a merger. But Cyrus, with the charm of a snake oil salesman and the strategic brilliance of a chess grandmaster, managed to bring them under his wing. The secret sauce, a mix of military prowess and political savvy, sprinkled with a dash of familial connections. You see, Cyrus's mother was a Mede princess, which made him an heir with a shiny claim, not just a grubby pretender from the sticks. By 550 BCE, Cyrus had taken control of the Median Empire, and with that, he had paved a nice, smooth road to further expansion. Next stop on the Cyrus Express, Lydia. Now, Lydia was not just some quaint little neighborhood. It was the Silicon Valley of the ancient world, thanks to its hefty gold reserves. The Lydian king, Croesus, was known for his wealth and a certain level of hubris that would make a tech billionaire blush. But despite his riches and confidence, Croesus found himself up against Cyrus and his visionary schemes. In 547 BCE, Cyrus decisively defeated Croesus and added Lydia to his growing portfolio. This wasn't just about acquiring a new set of lands. It was an economic power play. With Lydia's gold in his coffers, Cyrus wasn't just lining his pockets. He was setting the stage for a financial revolution. Money talks, and Cyrus was fast becoming fluent in this universal language. But gold wasn't just for counting. It was for building, trading, and importantly, paying armies to keep the empire's gears well-oiled and moving. What set Cyrus apart from your typical ancient conqueror was his flair for public relations. This guy could have taught modern spin doctors a thing or two. Rather than just rocking up with an army and demanding surrender, Cyrus billed himself as a liberator. To those under the thumb of oppressive rulers, he was like the ancient world's answer to a knight in shining armor. When he took Babylon in 539 BCE, he didn't just kick the door down and plunder. He issued the Cyrus cylinder, declaring himself a restorer of temples and a liberator of people. This clay artifact, often dubbed the first charter of human rights, might sound like a slick PR move, and it was. But it was also a stroke of genius that got people on his side. Cyrus's approach was not just about benevolence, it was strategic. By presenting himself as a liberator, he ensured local populations were more inclined to cooperate than rebel. This wasn't just altruism, it was a pragmatic approach to empire building. After all, fewer revolts mean less hassle. It's hard to argue with a strategy that minimizes the need for constant military intervention and keeps the tax base happy. It's important not to get too swept up in the romance of Cyrus's narrative, though. While his image as a liberator is appealing, let's not forget that empire building often involved a fair share of brutality. The realities of ancient warfare and conquest were far from the sanitized legends we sometimes hear. But Cyrus managed to balance the sword and the olive branch in a way that made him a standout figure in ancient history. As the dust settled on Cyrus's early conquests, the Persian Empire was on the map, not just as a collection of territories, but as a cohesive entity with a shared sense of identity and purpose. By the time Cyrus passed away in 530 BCE, he had laid the groundwork for an empire that would last for centuries, ruled by his successors who would continue to expand and consolidate his achievements. So, while Cyrus's story might start with a modest tribe in an isolated region, it doesn't end there. It morphs into an epic tale of ambition, strategy, and a bit of ancient world charisma that would echo through the ages. Cyrus the Great didn't just build an empire. He crafted a legacy that would influence countless generations. His ability to see beyond mere conquest to the art of statesmanship is what made him truly great. And as we dig further into the chronicles of the Persian Empire, remember that it all started with a man who dared to think bigger, act bolder, and, quite frankly, sell his story better than anyone before him. Speaking of selling stories better than anyone else, Cyrus's entrance into Babylon in 539 BCE was like the grand finale of a rock star's world tour. Here's the kicker. He didn't even have to storm the gates. No, Cyrus waltzed into Babylon with such smooth maneuvering that by the time he arrived, the city was practically rolling out the red carpet. This wasn't just a military conquest. It was a masterclass in PR and psychological warfare. Babylon was a jewel of the ancient world, a city that boasted impressive architecture, wealth, and a cultural tapestry as rich as Croesus's treasury. So how did Cyrus manage to pull this off without the usual bloodbath? Let's start with the propaganda. Cyrus didn't just stroll in as a conqueror. He strutted in as the liberator they never knew they needed. The Babylonians had been under the thumb of Nabonidus, a king who was, let's say, not winning any popularity contests. Imagine a ruler so unpopular that his own people were practically begging for a regime change. Cyrus cleverly positioned himself as the answer to their prayers, quite literally. He was painted as a messiah sent to restore order and religious freedom. The propagandists spun tales of divine favor. Marduk, the chief Babylonian guard, was supposedly on Team Cyrus. Now, whether Marduk actually filed any official endorsements is up for debate, but the narrative stuck like honey on a hot day. Cyrus's masterstroke was the Cyrus cylinder, an ancient press release, if you will. This artifact didn't just detail his conquests, it declared his intention to restore religious sanctuaries and return displaced peoples to their homelands. This was a political and cultural strategy that won hearts and minds. For the Babylonians, who had seen their fair share of oppressive rulers, Cyrus's promises of religious tolerance and restoration were music to their ears, or the ancient equivalent of a catchy tune. And let's not forget, music and religion were often intertwined in these ancient cities, much like a medieval rock opera. But let's not get too swept away by the romance of Cyrus the Savior. Benevolent ruler or not, running an empire wasn't all incense and hymns. It was a logistical nightmare on a scale that would make any modern CEO break into a cold sweat. Picture this, an empire stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, encompassing a dizzying array of cultures, languages, and local customs. Keeping this patchwork quilt of territories stitched together required more than just goodwill and good looks. It required cold, hard cash, and a complex administrative system. The Persian Empire under Cyrus was not just a military juggernaut, it was an economic powerhouse. Maintaining such a vast domain meant building infrastructure, roads, postal systems, and supply routes. Think early Amazon logistics, but with camels. The Royal Road, a marvel of ancient engineering, stretched over 600 miles and was crucial for moving troops, trade, and messages across the empire. This was the superhighway of its day, and it didn't come cheap. The cost of maintaining such infrastructure was staggering, and it required a steady influx of tribute from conquered territories. And let's talk about the real cost of empire, the human cost. Sure, Cyrus promised freedom and prosperity, but those promises often came with strings attached. Local rulers had to pledge allegiance, pay tribute, and sometimes supply troops. In essence, Cyrus was running the ancient world equivalent of a high-stakes subscription service, where non-payment could result in a not-so-friendly reminder from the Persian military. The empire's survival depended on a delicate balance of appeasement and intimidation. So, while Cyrus might have been hailed as a liberator in Babylon, it's worth questioning how universally beloved he actually was. For every temple he restored, there was a local leader who had to bow to Persian supremacy. For every freedom proclaimed, there was a tax levied to fund the empire's ever-expanding bureaucracy. And behind the facade of benevolence, there was always the underlying threat of force. It's the classic carrot and stick approach, except with more chariots and fewer actual carrots. As the Persian Empire burgeoned under Cyrus's rule, it became increasingly clear that sustaining such a vast and diverse entity required more than just military might or divine endorsements. It needed a keen understanding of diplomacy, economics, and cultural integration. Cyrus wasn't just a conqueror. He was an administrator, a statesman, and perhaps most importantly, a visionary who understood the power of narrative. His story was one of liberation and unity, but it was also a tale of power and control, a duality that would define the empire long after his death. Yet, the real genius of Cyrus lay in his ability to make people believe in his vision. He understood that an empire wasn't just about land or riches. It was about creating a shared identity. Through his policies and propaganda, he crafted a narrative that resonated across cultures and languages. This wasn't just an empire of territory. It was an empire of ideas, a blueprint that would influence successors like Darius and Xerxes. So, as we gaze back at Cyrus's remarkable journey from tribal leader to emperor, it's important to see beyond the myth. The man who walked into Babylon as a liberator was also a shrewd strategist who knew how to wield both the sword and the pen. His empire was built on the foundations of diplomacy, cultural respect, and economic savvy. And yet, it was also an empire that demanded obedience, tribute, and when necessary, submission. In the end, Cyrus the Great was a complex figure, as much a product of his time as a shaper of it. And as we continue our exploration of the Persian Empire, let's remember that history, like any good story, is rarely as simple as it seems. Just as Cyrus the Great perfected the art of empire building with a blend of diplomacy, military might, and a dash of spin, his son Cambyses Roman II was set to take the stage. But let's say his performance was more punk rock concert than symphony orchestra. When Cambyses ascended the throne in 530 BCE, he inherited not just an empire, but a legacy that demanded both expansion and careful management. So, what did Cambyses do with this grand sandbox of power? He grabbed a shovel and started digging into Egypt. Now, Egypt wasn't your run-of-the-mill vacation spot. It was the land of the pharaohs, pyramids, and an economy that could give any empire a run for its money. Rich in resources and culture, Egypt was a tempting target for Cambyses' ambitions, but this wasn't just about gold and grain. It was a prestige project. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of launching a flashy tech startup. Conquering Egypt would cement Cambyses' reputation as a conqueror worthy of his father's legacy. In 525 BCE, Cambyses launched his campaign into Egypt, and it was as much a logistical feat as it was a military one. We're talking about marching an army across the Sinai Peninsula, a kind of natural obstacle course of sand, heat, and dehydration. Imagine trying to herd cats across a desert, but the cats are heavily armed and cranky. Cambyses' forces faced this trek with grit, determination, and a healthy supply of water skins. According to Herodotus, the Greek historian who sometimes favored a good story over strict accuracy, Cambyses even struck a deal with the Arab tribes to ensure his troops didn't end up as sun-dried relics. When Cambyses finally squared off against the Egyptians at the Battle of Pelusium, he wasn't just fighting men. He was battling centuries of Egyptian dominance. The Egyptians, led by Pharaoh Psamtik III, put up a valiant fight, but Cambyses had a trick up his sleeve that was straight out of a strategist's playbook. Legend has it that Cambyses used cats as a psychological weapon. Since cats were sacred in Egypt, the Persian army supposedly carried them into battle, knowing the Egyptians would hesitate to harm their divine felines. Now, whether this clever feline maneuver actually happened, or was just a colorful tale spun by Herodotus, is still up for debate. Either way, it paints a vivid picture of Cambyses' willingness to exploit local beliefs for tactical advantage. With the Egyptians defeated, Cambyses marched into Memphis, the heart of Egyptian power, like he was taking a victory lap. He secured control over Egypt, but his triumphs masked a reign marked by controversy and instability. Unlike his father, Cambyses didn't quite master the art of PR, where Cyrus was seen as a liberator. Cambyses was often viewed as a conqueror, plain and simple. But here's where things get really interesting. Cambyses' reputation took a nosedive thanks to what some historians refer to as the Mad King narrative. According to Herodotus, Cambyses was prone to bouts of violence and irrationality, once allegedly stabbing the sacred Apis bull, an act of sacrilege that would make even the most hardened conqueror wince. Was Cambyses truly the unhinged ruler Herodotus describes, or is this just a case of ancient gossip gone wild? Given that Herodotus wrote with a flair for drama, it's wise to take these tales with a grain of salt, or perhaps a whole handful. The economic realities of Cambyses' reign were also less glamorous than the stories of conquest. Maintaining control over Egypt meant dealing with its complex bureaucracy and keeping the Nile's agricultural bounty flowing into Persian coffers. The Persians had to navigate local customs and integrate Egyptian officials into their administration. This was no small task. It was like trying to merge two corporate cultures with vastly different operating systems. Cambyses might have worn the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, but winning over the local populace was a different challenge altogether. Despite the controversies, Cambyses' Egyptian campaign was a critical chapter in the Persian Empire's expansion. It demonstrated the empire's ability to project power far beyond its original borders, setting the stage for future rulers like Darius I to build upon. The conquest of Egypt wasn't just about land. It was about showing the world that the Persians were a force to be reckoned with. As for Cambyses himself, his reign was a roller coaster of achievement and disaster, punctuated by moments of brilliance and madness. While the tales of his erratic behavior persist, it's important to remember that history is often written by those with an agenda. The Greeks, after all, weren't exactly fans of Persian rulers, and Herodotus' account should be seen through the lens of a storyteller with a particular narrative to sell. In the end, Cambyses' story reminds us that leadership is as much about perception as it is about power. While Cyrus, the Great, mastered the art of crafting a narrative that inspired loyalty and admiration, Cambyses struggled to shake off the shadow of unflattering stories. Whether he was truly the mad king of Herodotus' imagination, or simply a ruler faced with the monumental task of maintaining an ever-growing empire, Cambyses' legacy is a complex tapestry of triumphs and missteps. As we continue to unravel the history of the Persian Empire, it's clear that each ruler contributed to the empire's character in distinct ways. Cambyses' reign, with all its drama and intrigue, set the stage for his successor, Darius I, to take the helm. And as we look forward to exploring Darius's transformative impact on the empire, let's keep in mind that history, much like the stories told by Herodotus, is rarely neat and tidy. It's a sprawling narrative of ambition, conflict, and human nature at its most compelling. And speaking of narratives that blend truth and theatre, enter Darius I, the man who would take the Persian Empire from its rock and roll phase into a full-blown symphony. If Cambyses was the chaotic encore, Darius was the maestro orchestrating a new era of stability and growth. But let's not get too misty-eyed just yet. Darius wasn't just polishing the empire's brass. He was also the guy who stomped out rebellions with the efficiency of a Roomba on a mission. Darius came to power in 522 BCE, not through peaceful succession, but by quelling what you might call a palace kerfuffle involving impostors and internal strife. Cambyses' untimely demise left a power vacuum that attracted more chaos than a toddler's birthday party. Darius seized the moment, and with a blend of cunning and a bit of good old-fashioned muscle, he snatched the throne from the clutches of chaos. Once seated firmly on the Persian throne, Darius didn't just twiddle his thumbs. No, he launched into a reform frenzy like an ancient CEO with a serious case of ambition. His first order of business, unifying and organizing the sprawling empire so it didn't collapse under its own weight. Imagine trying to run a multinational corporation with branches in 20 different cultures, each with its own language and customs. Darius needed more than a universal translator. He needed a revolution in administration. Cue the Royal Road, that venerable ancient highway stretching an impressive 600 miles from Sardis to Susa. It was the backbone of Darius's empire, a superhighway for couriers, armies, and trade, speeding messages in just 7 days that would normally take 3 months. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a fiber optic network, but with more dust and less bandwidth. This road wasn't just about moving goods and messages. It was about cementing control and ensuring that the emperor's reach was as long as his empire. But roads alone don't build an empire. They just connect it. Darius also introduced a standardized coinage system, the Daric, which was the Bitcoin of its day, minus the wild fluctuations and digital wallets. This gold coin smoothed commerce across the empire, replacing barter systems that were about as efficient as a one-legged horse in a derby. With coins jingling in their pockets, merchants could trade from Egypt to India without a hitch. It wasn't just a financial move. It was a unifying force, creating a common economic language in a diverse empire. Now, if you think this sounds like a benevolent ruler in action, hold your chariots. Darius's reign was also marked by its fair share of bloodshed. Revolts popped up like weeds across the empire as local leaders tested the new ruler's mettle. Darius responded with a mix of diplomacy and decisive military action, like a chess player who isn't afraid to knock over the board if the game goes south. For instance, the Babylonian revolt of 522 BCE was quashed with a swiftness that left little room for debate about who was in charge. Let's not pretend, though, that Darius was just a misunderstood ruler with a penchant for order. He was also a pragmatic enforcer who understood that you can't manage an empire with kid gloves. Those who rose against him often found themselves at the wrong end of a sword. Yet, his harsh measures were wrapped in the kind of administrative genius that turned a patchwork of provinces into a well-oiled machine. Darius was a master of management, creating satrapies, essentially provinces, each governed by a satrap who answered directly to him. These governors were like regional managers who had to balance local autonomy with loyalty to the central empire. It was a delicate dance of power, but it created a model of governance that kept the empire humming along. This system wasn't just about control. It was about efficiency and stability, ensuring that the satraps could handle local issues while Darius focused on the big picture. But governance is more than just roads and coins. Darius also had a flair for propaganda, much like his predecessor Cyrus. He commissioned the Behistun inscription, a massive rock relief, and accompanying text that proclaimed his divine right to rule. It was the ancient world's version of a viral tweet, etched into stone for all to see. This wasn't just about bragging rights. It was about legitimizing his rule in the eyes of both his subjects and the guards. And let's not forget the economic powerhouse that was the Persian Empire under Darius. With a vast network of trade routes, The empire became a bustling hub of commerce, connecting the East and West in a way that would rival any modern trade agreement. The influx of goods, ideas, and culture helped to enrich the empire, turning it into a melting pot that thrived on diversity. Yet, Darius's image as a benevolent ruler is complicated by his firm grip on power. While he is celebrated for his administrative reforms, he also maintained a network of spies, known as the King's Eyes, who ensured that loyalty was more than just a suggestion. This was less about benevolence and more about ensuring that the empire didn't splinter into 1,000 pieces. Darius understood that in a realm as vast as his, trust was good, but surveillance was better. It's easy to get swept up in the tales of Darius, the administrator and reformer. But let's not gloss over the darker side of his reign. His consolidation of power didn't just rely on brilliant policies. It was backed by an iron fist. Revolts were crushed, dissent was silenced, and the empire's unity was preserved at a cost. It was a balancing act of power, where the line between order and oppression was often blurred. So, as we continue this journey through the Persian Empire, let's remember Darius not just as the great organizer and visionary, but also as a ruler who knew that the art of empire was as much about control as it was about creativity. His reign set the stage for the empire's future, and his legacy is a testament to the complexity of leadership in an ancient world where stability was both a gift and a hard-won prize. Darius, I was a man who understood the stakes of empire building in a world where failure was not an option. His story is one of relentless ambition, shrewd strategy, and a little bit of ruthlessness thrown in for good measure. And as we look ahead to the next chapter of the Persian Empire, remember that Darius's legacy is as much about the lessons of power as it is about the triumphs of administration. So, Darius, I had a plan. Take the Persian Empire from its chaotic beginnings to a well-oiled machine, with himself at the helm as the empire's chief engineer. But what's the legacy of a ruler who was as much a spreadsheet wizard as a sword-wielding warrior? Well, grab your historical compass, because we're about to navigate the lasting impact of Darius's reign, a legacy that's as intricate as the empire itself. First, let's tackle the elephant in the room, the myth of Persian decadence. You know, the image of opulent palaces overflowing with silk, spices, and enough peacocks to rival a Victorian garden party. While it's true that the Persian Empire had its fair share of luxury, after all, Darius's palace at Persepolis was a marvel of ancient architecture. This narrative often overlooks a crucial point. The empire's real backbone wasn't decadence, it was strategic brilliance and practical governance. Darius wasn't lounging on a divan, plucking grapes from a golden platter. He was busy streamlining the empire like a seasoned CEO. Take, for instance, the empire's administrative setup. Darius divided his realm into around 20 satrapies, each run by a governor called a satrap. These weren't just bureaucratic figureheads. They were crucial cogs in the empire's machinery, responsible for collecting taxes, overseeing justice, and maintaining order. It's like running a franchise with each branch manager accountable for local operations, but with a bit more at stake than burger sales. And to keep these satraps from going rogue like a pack of rebellious teenagers, Darius implemented a system of checks and balances. The King's Eyes, essentially a network of imperial spies, ensured that loyalty didn't just drift away like an unattended kite. Now, let's talk money because, as any empire builder knows, you can't run a realm on goodwill alone. Darius introduced a standardized tax system that would make even the IRS nod in approval. Each satrapy was assessed based on its economic potential, and taxes were collected in the form of silver and gold, supporting the empire's vast military and infrastructure projects. It wasn't just a cash grab. It was an economic strategy that kept the empire's engine running smoothly. And speaking of engines, let's give a nod to the Persian infrastructure. Darius's empire was crisscrossed with roads that would put a modern highway system to shame. The Royal Road, for instance, wasn't just a marvel of engineering. It was a tool for control, commerce, and communication. Couriers, think of them as the ancient world's FedEx, could traverse its length in record time, ensuring that messages from the emperor could reach the farthest corners of the empire faster than a Persian could say propaganda. But Darius's brilliance wasn't just about logistics and tax codes. He understood the power of cultural integration, a concept that was revolutionary at a time when most empires preferred the conquer and crush method. Rather than imposing a one-size-fits-all approach, Darius allowed his subjects to keep their languages, religions, and traditions, as long as they paid their dues and acknowledged Persian supremacy. This wasn't just enlightened governance. It was a strategic move that minimized rebellion and maximized efficiency. Under Darius, the Persian Empire became a cultural melting pot, where Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, and countless other traditions intermingled. This cross-cultural exchange wasn't just a happy accident. It was a deliberate policy that enriched the empire and paved the way for a shared identity that transcended borders. But let's not paint too rosy a picture. This was still an empire built on conquest and control, and Darius wasn't afraid to wield his authority with an iron fist when necessary. For every festival celebrating cultural diversity, there was a military campaign to remind the subjects of who held the real power. Now, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, where the Persian Empire under Darius became a heavyweight contender on the global stage. His reign set the stage for future conflicts with Greece, a series of epic showdowns that will be immortalized by later historians and filmmakers alike. The Greco-Persian Wars, sparked during Darius's rule, were more than just battles over territory. They were clashes of culture and ideology. Darius's attempts to subdue the pesky Greek city-states were as much about demonstrating Persian dominance as they were about expanding borders. And while Darius didn't live to see the famous battles of Marathon or Thermopylae, his imperial policies laid the groundwork for these conflicts. The Greek resistance to Persian rule wasn't just about freedom. It was about autonomy and the desire to maintain their unique identities. It's a reminder that empires, no matter how powerful, often face resistance from those who value independence over subjugation. But let's circle back to Darius's legacy, which is as complex as the empire he ruled. He left behind more than just a sprawling territory. He bequeathed a model of governance that would influence empires for centuries to come. His blend of autocratic control and cultural integration wasn't just a means of maintaining order. It was a blueprint for effective leadership in a diverse and complex world. Darius's reign reminds us that empires, much like their rulers, are defined by their ability to adapt and innovate. So, as we wrap up this journey through the rise of the Persian Empire, let's doff our historical hats to Darius I, a ruler whose vision extended beyond the horizon. His empire wasn't just a collection of conquered lands. It was a testament to the power of strategic governance and cultural synthesis. And while the Persian Empire would eventually fall to Alexander the Great, its influence would echo through history, shaping the world in ways that even Darius couldn't have imagined. In the end, the story of the Persian Empire is a tale of ambition, power, and the relentless pursuit of greatness. It's a reminder that history is as much about the people who shape it as it is about the events that unfold. And as we close the book on this chapter of ancient history, let's carry with us the lessons of Darius's reign, a legacy that, like the empire itself, is a rich tapestry of triumphs and trials, woven together by the hands of a ruler who dared to dream big and act boldly. A time when the world was more about wooden sandals than Wi-Fi, Confucius, or Kang Q, as he was originally known, made his entrance into the world in 551 BCE in the state of Lu. Now, Lu wasn't exactly the bustling metropolis of its day. Think more along the lines of a quaint village whose claims to fame were rice paddies and the occasional philosophical musing. Confucius didn't burst onto the scene with a silver spoon in his mouth. Rather, was more of a well-worn, slightly chipped porcelain one, because his family, despite noble ancestry, was about as rich as a monk's vow of poverty. Confucius grew up in a single-parent household, which was as rare back then as a unicorn sighting today. His father, a military man with a penchant for marrying much younger women, passed away when Confucius was just 3. His mother, Yan Zhengzai, was left to raise him. She was the single mom champion before it was a hashtag, instilling in young Confucius the values that would one day grace countless fortune cookies around the world. But let's not romanticize it too much. Life was tough, and Confucius wasn't exactly lounging around in silk robes. He had to work, and work hard. His first job, a lowly position as a keeper of granaries and public lands. Yet, Confucius, a man whose thoughts would eventually shape civilizations, started out counting sacks of rice and keeping track of who borrowed the village oxen. If you think modern bureaucracy is a nightmare, imagine dealing with it in ancient China, where losing a document meant it was probably eaten by a goat. It wasn't glamorous, but it was here, amid the dusty ledgers and endless inventories, that Confucius began to develop his philosophies. He saw the absurdity of human pettiness and the inefficiencies of governance, which sparked his desire for a more orderly and just society. Confucius had a knack for finding humor in the absurdities of life. Picture this, a young Confucius, not yet the sage of sages, chuckling at the paradoxes of bureaucracy. He'd probably get a kick out of the fact that despite the rigorous checks and balances, someone always managed to misplace a cow or two. This early exposure to the quirks of administration undoubtedly influenced his later teachings on the importance of integrity and responsibility in government. Despite the grim realities of his job, Confucius was a people watcher, a keen observer of human nature. He noticed that while the officials in charge were more concerned with feathering their own nests than the well-being of the people, the common folk just wanted to get on with life without too much interference. These observations shaped his belief that rulers should be moral exemplars, a radical idea at the time when power often came from the business end of a sword. But let's not put Confucius on too high a pedestal just yet. Remember, this was a man who, according to legend, once got so fed up with the political nonsense that he took a sabbatical from public life, only to return when he realized he couldn't escape the drama even if he tried. His brief foray into retirement was less about peaceful contemplation and more about dodging the medieval equivalent of office politics. Confucius' early brushes with the inefficiency of the state were pivotal. They laid the groundwork for his later teachings, which emphasized the need for ethical governance and education. He wasn't just spouting off lofty ideals. He was offering practical solutions to real-world problems, like how not to lose track of the empire's goats. And there you have it. Confucius, the man, the myth, the granary keeper. His early years were far from the serene imagery often associated with sages. Instead, they were filled with the same kind of everyday struggles that people face today. This period of his life was crucial in shaping his ideas about morality, leadership, and society. He taught that wisdom comes not from avoiding life's absurdities, but from engaging with them. An idea as relevant now as it was 500 years ago. So next time you find yourself buried under paperwork, remember, even the greatest minds started somewhere, and sometimes that somewhere involves counting sacks of rice in a dusty storeroom. Confucius, the man who started his grand journey amidst the grain sacks, would soon find himself in the thick of an era that seemed like an ancient soap opera on steroids, the spring and autumn period. Now, if you think today's political climate is chaotic, it's got nothing on the shenanigans that went down over 500 years ago in China. Picture a society where warlords were as common as reality TV stars, and just as hungry for power. It was a time of endless skirmishes, shifting alliances, and the kind of backstabbing that would make even the most seasoned Game of Thrones character feel a little queasy. In this tumultuous backdrop, Confucius developed his ideas about ethics, family, and governance. He believed in the concept of ren, or benevolence, a kind of moral compass that, if followed, would lead to a harmonious society. Think of it as the ancient Chinese version of Kant, we all just get along. But this wasn't just some lofty ideal for Confucius. Oh no, he was all about putting theory into practice. And that's where things got interesting. Before we dive into his real-world escapades, let's not forget the family angle. In Confucius's world, the family was the cornerstone of society. The dude was like the original family therapist, insisting that if you couldn't get along with your parents, you probably had no business trying to govern a state. He preached that filial piety, or respect for one's elders, was the foundation of a stable society. It seems like common sense, right? But in an era where loyalty could change faster than you can say double-cross, this was a revolutionary idea. With these principles in his toolkit, Confucius took his talents to the political arena. This is where the fun really begins. His first noble position was as the Minister of Crime in the state of Lu. Sounds like a role tailor-made for a law and order spin-off, doesn't it? Armed with his trusty sidekick, Logic, Confucius implemented reforms that reduced crime significantly. Legend has it that during his tenure, crime rates dropped so low that you could leave your front door unlocked without worrying about someone waltzing in and making off with your prized chicken. But not everyone was thrilled with Confucius's success. The power-hungry nobles of Lu, who thrived on chaos like moths to a flame, were less than pleased with a law-abiding society. They figured a little anarchy kept things interesting. So they conspired to get rid of him. And here's where Confucius's idealism met its match in the form of political shenanigans. Despite his successes, he found himself sidelined and eventually had to leave Lu in search of a more appreciative audience. Confucius's journey through the political landscape was like watching an underdog sports movie, except instead of winning the championship, our hero was perpetually benched. He traveled from state to state, offering his wisdom to rulers who were more interested in expanding their territory than in expanding their minds. The warlords of the time were a stubborn bunch, more inclined to wield swords than to engage in philosophical debates over tea. One particularly memorable incident involved Confucius trying to impress a ruler with the importance of moral integrity. The ruler, more interested in immediate gains than in long-term ethics, listened politely, but then promptly ignored everything Confucius said. It was a classic case of pearls before swine, and if Confucius had a nickel for every time this happened, he'd probably have been able to retire comfortably on a small island somewhere, far from the political madness. Yet, despite these setbacks, Confucius never gave up. His teachings on governance were built on the idea that leaders should be moral exemplars. They should govern not through fear or brute force, but through virtue and righteousness. To him, a ruler's role was akin to that of a shepherd, guiding the flock with care and wisdom. It was a vision that was both idealistic and, let's be honest, a bit ahead of its time, a fact not lost on the rulers who preferred the old reliable method of ruling with an iron fist. The thing about Confucius was that he was both a realist and an idealist, a rare combination that made him a fascinating character, but also one who was constantly at odds with the realities of his day. He understood that his ideas were radical and difficult to implement in a world driven by power struggles. Yet, he remained undeterred, spreading his teachings like seeds in the wind, hoping that someday they'd take root and grow. If you're wondering how Confucius managed to stay optimistic in the face of such relentless opposition, you're not alone. It's one of those great mysteries of history, like why anyone thought powdered wigs were a good fashion statement. Perhaps it was his unshakable belief in the inherent goodness of humanity. Or maybe it was the knowledge that even if he didn't see the fruits of his labor, the seeds he planted would eventually bloom. And bloom they did, but not in his lifetime. Confucius's teachings would go on to shape Chinese society for centuries, influencing countless generations and leaving an indelible mark on the world. But that's a story for another day. For now, let's leave Confucius as he was in life, a persistent sage, unfazed by the absurdities of human nature, forever chasing the elusive dream of a just and moral society. As we wrap up this chapter, it's worth noting that while Confucius may not have revolutionized governance during his lifetime, he certainly revolutionized the way people thought about it. His teachings challenged the status quo, offering a vision of a world where leaders led by example and ethics mattered more than might. It's a vision that remains as compelling today as it was in the chaotic days of the spring and autumn period. Stay tuned, because Confucius's story is far from over, and the best, or perhaps the most perplexing, is yet to come. Confucius's story, far from over, was just gearing up for what can only be described as the ancient world's version of a failed rock tour. He hit the road, armed with scrolls of wisdom and an unwavering idealism that might make even the most hardened cynic raise an eyebrow. The plan, to find a ruler who would embrace his teachings and transform society. The result? Well, let's just say it was a mixed bag, with moments of hope, hilarity, and a hefty dose of reality checks, as Confucius meandered through the patchwork of Chinese states, each with its own brand of chaos. He encountered a variety of receptions. Some states welcomed him with open arms, treating him like a sage on a mission. In these places, Confucius was the intellectual equivalent of a headlining act, drawing crowds eager to hear his thoughts on governance and morality. But in other locales, reception was chilly, like being the opening act at a concert where everyone's really just there for the headliner. He was often shown the door, sometimes literally, as rulers decided they preferred their old ways of intrigue and power games. Imagine Confucius stepping into a ruler's court, ready to deliver a master class in ethical governance, only to be met with the medieval version of a polite nod and a quick change of subject. It was like trying to sell sunscreen in a snowstorm. In a world where political alliances were as stable as a Jenga tower in an earthquake, Confucius's ideas were radical. His emphasis on virtue and benevolence seemed out of place in an era where might made right, and swords settled debates more often than words. Yet, Confucius wasn't just another philosopher with his head in the clouds. He was a practical man, trying to offer real solutions to real problems. He believed that a ruler should be like the North Star, fixed in place, guiding his subjects with unwavering integrity. But let's be real, in a time when changing sides was as common as changing robes, this was a tough sell. Many rulers viewed his teachings as idealistic at best, and at worst, a threat to their authority. But our man Confucius was nothing if not persistent. His travels took him to the states of Wei, Song, Zheng, and beyond. Each journey was a roll of the dice, a gamble that his ideas might finally find fertile ground. In Wei, he found fleeting success and a ruler who seemed intrigued by his ideas. But as was often the case, political winds shifted, and Confucius was left packing his bags yet again. In Song, the situation was even more precarious. Legend has it that while there, he narrowly escaped an assassination attempt, proof, if any was needed, that philosophy could be as dangerous as politics itself. Confucius's roadshow was a masterclass in the art of resilience. Despite the setbacks, he remained undeterred, buoyed by the belief that his teachings held the key to a better society. And while rulers were often dismissive, the common folk began to take notice. Here was a man who spoke of justice and integrity, who dared to imagine a world where leaders were respected because of their virtue, not their ability to wield power. It's worth noting the economic realities that underscored this journey. Travel in ancient China wasn't a simple affair. We're talking long treks over rough terrain, with the constant threat of bandits and other hazards. Confucius didn't have the luxury of a royal entourage. His journeys were often funded through the generosity of his followers, who believed in his vision enough to part with their hard-earned resources. In a time when a good horse cost about 10,000 coins, and a night's lodging could set you back 20 coins, every journey was a logistical challenge. Despite these hurdles, Confucius's travels weren't just about spreading his ideas. They were also a chance to learn, to observe the different ways people lived and governed. He saw firsthand the disparities between the ruling class and the common people, the corruption that permeated the courts, and the struggles of the everyday man. These observations enriched his teachings, giving them a depth and relevance that resonated long after his death. Confucius was a man out of time, a visionary in an age that wasn't quite ready for his vision. Yet, he planted seeds of thought that would eventually take root, shaping the fabric of Chinese society for centuries. His roadshow might not have found the enthusiastic patron he sought, but it did something arguably more important. It laid the groundwork for a philosophical legacy that would endure. In the end, Confucius's journey across the Chinese states was a testament to his belief in the power of ideas. He understood that change was slow, that the world wouldn't transform overnight, but he also knew that every conversation, every lecture, was a step toward a future where wisdom and virtue would guide humanity. So, as we leave Confucius on the dusty roads of ancient China, remember that his journey was both a comedy of errors and a saga of hope. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important journeys are those that seem to lead nowhere, yet leave a trail of inspiration that others will follow. Stay tuned, because Confucius's story is far from over, and the road ahead is as winding and unpredictable as ever. As Confucius trudged along the dusty roads of ancient China, searching for a ruler who might actually appreciate a good lesson in ethics, he was unwittingly setting the stage for his next big act. And let's just say, underdog stories don't always end in a championship win, but they sure do make for a riveting tale. Eventually, Confucius found himself back in his home state of Lu, a place that had changed little during his absence. War and political intrigue still reigned supreme, but this time, Confucius had something new to offer, an educational revolution. You see, in a world where the intellectual elite was more exclusive than a celebrity after-party, Confucius dared to open the doors to those who could afford to knock, and thus the Confucian school, or what we might cheekily call the first private university, was born. Confucius didn't just teach philosophy, he taught governance, history, poetry, and even ritual music. If you think your college curriculum was demanding, imagine juggling the Analects, the Book of Rites, and the Spring and Autumn Annals. His students weren't just learning how to think, they were learning how to lead. But let's pump the brakes on the legend of Confucius and his thousands of disciples. The idea that he had a veritable army of followers is about as accurate as a movie trailer giving away the entire plot. In reality, estimates suggest he had about 70 regular students at any given time. Sure, it's not as headline-grabbing as thousands, but it's impressive when you consider the economic realities of the time. Education under Confucius wasn't free. The cost of tuition back then was roughly equivalent to a year's salary for a common laborer, about 1,000 coins. That's a hefty price tag, especially when you consider that a family could live on around 200 coins a year. So, Confucius's students were typically from well-to-do families who could afford the luxury of a classical education. In this light, Confucius was less a sage surrounded by a sea of eager learners, and more an exclusive mentor to the ancient Chinese version of trust fund kids. But don't let that diminish his impact. These students would go on to be the bureaucrats, the decision makers, and the influencers of their day. Think of them as the original influencers, but instead of promoting skincare routines, they were promoting governance reform and ethical leadership. Now, Confucius wasn't just about churning out diplomats and ministers. He emphasized character development, making sure his students understood the importance of ren, benevolence, and lai, ritual propriety. It was a holistic education that aimed to produce well-rounded individuals, not just walking encyclopedias. Confucius's educational endeavors were revolutionary. They weren't without their challenges. The socio-economic divide was a persistent hurdle. Many talented individuals were sidelined simply because they couldn't afford the tuition. Confucius himself lamented this, famously stating, "I do not open up the truth to one who is not eager to get knowledge, nor help out anyone who is not anxious to explain himself." Translation: if you're not putting in the effort, don't expect a handout. Despite these barriers, Confucius's school became a hub of intellectual activity. It was like the ancient world's version of Silicon Valley, but instead of coding, they were decrypting the complexities of human nature and governance. His teachings gained traction, not because they were easy or popular, but because they addressed the core issues of the time: morality, leadership, and the art of living. But let's not romanticize it too much. The reality was that many of Confucius's ideas were not embraced until long after his death. His later years were marked by frustration as he watched the world around him continue to spiral into chaos. Yet, he remained committed to his vision, convinced that education was the key to societal transformation. Confucius's return to Lu was not just a homecoming, it was a strategic move. By establishing his school, he ensured that his ideas would outlive him, carried forward by a new generation of thinkers and leaders. It was a gamble, but one that paid off in spades, as Confucianism eventually became the philosophical foundation of Chinese society for over 2 millennia. So, while Confucius didn't live to see his teachings become the cornerstone of Chinese culture, he laid the groundwork for a legacy that would endure. In his later years, Confucius might not have been the rock-star sage he envisioned, but he was the architect of an intellectual movement that reshaped the world. As we close this chapter on Confucius's life, remember that his journey was as much about the wisdom he imparted as it was about the challenges he faced. His story is a testament to the power of education and the enduring impact of a single visionary, even in the face of overwhelming odds. But hold on to your hats, because the tale of Confucius isn't finished yet. The seeds he planted are just beginning to sprout, and the next chapter promises to be as enlightening as the last. Stay tuned. So, as Confucius left behind the dusty lecture halls of Lu, he probably couldn't have guessed how his ideas would fare in the centuries to come. Fast forward a bit, and enter the Warring States period, a time when diplomacy was as rare as a snowstorm in the Sahara. This era, which lasted from about 475 to 221 BCE, was less about who could talk their way out of a paper bag, and more about who could swing the heaviest sword. Yet, amidst the chaos, Confucius's teachings found unlikely allies in the form of scholars and statesmen who were tired of the bloodshed and eager for a philosophical lifeline. Confucianism, initially sidelined in favor of more immediate solutions like "let's conquer the neighbor," began to gain traction. Imagine a world where the latest trend wasn't the newest TikTok challenge, but rather a scroll filled with Confucian wisdom. Why? Because warring states needed something to unite them beyond the might of their armies. Here's where Confucius's teachings on ethics and governance became as appealing as a cool drink in the desert heat. They offered a way to bring order to the madness, a blueprint for building a society on principles rather than power alone. Now, let's not get too starry-eyed. Confucius wasn't the only game in town. Competing philosophies like legalism were all about rules, laws, and more rules, kind of like the HOA for ancient China. Legalism's iron-fisted approach was all the rage with rulers who wanted to keep their subjects in line. But Confucianism had something legalism lacked, a human touch. It didn't just focus on the end result, but considered how you got there. In a world as harsh as the warring states, this was revolutionary. Despite political turbulence, Confucianism survived, thanks in no small part to influential followers like Mencius and Zunzi. Mencius, the glass-half-full guy, believed humans were inherently good and just needed the right environment to flourish. Meanwhile, Zunzi took a more cynical view, arguing that people were naturally selfish and required guidance to act morally. Together, they fleshed out Confucius's teachings, giving them the depth and nuance needed to endure. It was like a philosophical buddy cop movie, with Mencius and Zunzi driving the Confucian bus through the treacherous terrain of ancient China. By the time the dust settled in 221 BCE and the Qin dynasty rose to power, Confucianism had taken root, albeit with a few weeds here and there. The Qin, known for their love of legalism and the Great Wall, weren't exactly Confucius's biggest fans. In fact, they went on a book-burning spree that would make any librarian cry. But Confucianism, like a stubborn dandelion, refused to be eradicated. Enter the Han dynasty in 206 BCE, who wisely decided that Confucius might have been onto something after all. The Han emperors, in a bid to legitimize their rule, embraced Confucianism as the state philosophy. It was a match made in heaven, or at least in the bureaucratic offices of the time. Confucius's ideas on governance, education, and morality were codified into the imperial system, transforming them from radical musings into the backbone of Chinese society. This official endorsement was like a winning lottery ticket for Confucianism. Suddenly, studying Confucius became the equivalent of getting an MBA from Harvard. The imperial civil service exams were steeped in Confucian texts, ensuring that the bureaucrats running the empire were well versed in his teachings. It was a practical move. After all, who better to run a massive empire than folks trained in the art of ethical governance? The Confucian curriculum was as rigorous as it was comprehensive, covering everything from proper conduct and filial piety to the importance of ritual and ceremony. The irony of Confucius's teachings becoming the establishment would not have been lost on the man himself. Remember, this was someone who spent much of his life railing against the power-hungry elite, only for his ideas to eventually become their guiding principles. If Confucius were around, he'd probably chuckle at the thought of emperors quoting his analects, while simultaneously engaging in the very political machinations he once decried. It's the kind of cosmic joke that history loves to play. As centuries rolled on, Confucianism became so ingrained in Chinese culture that it was harder to find someone who hadn't heard of Confucius than someone who had. His philosophies influenced everything from family life to statecraft, becoming the default setting for Chinese society. Confucian values like respect for elders, the importance of education, and the role of rituals became as ubiquitous as chopsticks at dinner. And it wasn't just China. Confucius's influence spread throughout East Asia, reaching Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. His ideas on governance and ethics resonated across borders, shaping societies in ways that would have been unimaginable during his lifetime. It's as if Confucius had become the philosophical equivalent of a viral meme, ubiquitous and influential, yet understood in myriad ways. Fast forward to the modern era, and you'll find Confucianism still hanging around, like a wise old grandparent with stories to tell. Its impact on governance, can be seen in the emphasis on meritocracy and education in many East Asian countries. It's no coincidence that these nations often top international education rankings. The Confucian focus on the value of learning and self-improvement is alive and well, helping to shape some of the world's most dynamic economies. But let's not gloss over the bumps in the road. Confucianism has faced its share of criticism, particularly regarding its views on hierarchy and gender roles. Critics argue that its emphasis on filial piety and respect for authority can stifle innovation and reinforce societal inequalities. And while Confucius himself might not have been a proponent of rigid social structures, the interpretation of his teachings over time has often leaned that way. Despite these challenges, Confucius's legacy endures. His ideas continue to spark debate and inspire reform. In a world that often feels as chaotic as the Warring States period, Confucius's call for ethical leadership and moral integrity remains as relevant as ever. Maybe that's the secret to his lasting influence, a vision of humanity that, while idealistic, is grounded in the realities of human nature. So, as we wrap up this journey through Confucius's life and legacy, let's remember him not as a dusty relic of the past, but as a thinker whose ideas continue to light the way forward. His story is a testament to the power of ideas, the resilience of philosophy, and the enduring quest for a more just world. Confucius may have walked the dusty roads of ancient China, but his influence spans continents and centuries, a legacy as vast and enduring as the man himself.